In the back room of a small hardware store, Gordon sat on a folding chair beside a desk that still held a landline phone and a stack of invoices from the last decade. The room smelled of dust, old cardboard, and the faint metal tang of nails and washers. It was the kind of smell that tells a person time has been passing without ceremony. Gordon had owned the place for 43 years. People in town called him steady, reliable. The kind of man who never missed a day unless he had a fever high enough to scare his wife. Being needed became a reputation he wore like a coat, heavy, familiar, and hard to remove. That morning, the younger manager had suggested Gordon take a week away from the store. Nothing dramatic, just rest. Just stop arriving early and leaving late. Gordon nodded the way he always nodded when someone offered him a change he did not plan to make. But as he sat alone, Gordon felt a different tiredness. Not the kind that comes from a long day on concrete floors. Not the kind that fades after sleep. This tiredness felt like an inventory, as if his body had been keeping notes. He thought about dinners missed because a customer needed a key cut. Weekends cancelled because a shipment arrived late. Evenings spent in the office while his wife washed dishes alone, the television talking to an empty living room. None of it felt like a mistake at the time. It felt like responsibility. He always told himself he was building something, providing, staying useful. He told himself the sacrifices were temporary, that later would be calmer. Later arrived quietly. It arrived in the form of an empty chair at the kitchen table. It arrived in the form of a son who no longer asked him to go fishing. It arrived in the form of a wife who learned to stop waiting in doorways. In the front of the store, he could hear the faint shape of the day continuing without him. A phone ringing. A drawer opening. A small laugh. Life was moving forward with or without his presence. And that truth landed in him with a clarity that did not need drama. The regret was not a sharp knife. It was the slow realization that postponing life becomes a habit. A person keeps saying later until later becomes the only time left. Gordon stood and walked to the back door. Outside, the air was cold and clean. He listened to the ordinary sounds of wind and branches moving. There were no requests in the air, no problems to solve. Just a few quiet minutes that belonged to nobody else. Regret, in this stage of life, is often less about what went wrong and more about what stayed unfinished. The unreturned calls, the nights never sat through, the small human moments traded away for a kind of duty that never ends on its own. Gordon stayed outside for a little while longer and breathed as if he were learning a new language. Then he went back in, not to prove anything, but to finish the day with his eyes open. After 50, this is how regret often appears. Not as punishment, but as information. A quiet signal that time does not respond to good intentions. It only responds to presence. On his lunch break, Gordon walked the aisles slowly and noticed the small details he had stopped seeing. The way the fluorescent light flattened every color. The way dust collected on the top shelf where no one ever reached. The way the bell above the front door gave the same thin sound each time, like a tiny announcement. He remembered the earlier years when the store felt like a dream he could touch. He remembered lifting boxes with a younger back, opening the doors before sunrise, feeling proud that he could pay the bills on time. The pride was real. The work mattered. The regret did not erase that. What regret did was reorder the value of the hours. He understood, with a quiet precision, that effort does not automatically create meaning. It creates structure. It creates safety. It creates proof that a person tried. But meaning is made from attention, and attention is the one thing a person cannot earn back once it is spent. When the afternoon slowed, Gordon wrote a note on a scrap of paper and tucked it into his pocket. A simple reminder: leave on time, walk around the block, call your sister, sit in the kitchen with no television. Nothing heroic, just small choices that return a person to their own life. Outside, the air stayed cold. The trees kept moving. The world did not rush. And that was the lesson he could finally accept. Time does not wait for a perfect moment. It only offers ordinary ones. The regret comes later, when a person realizes how many ordinary moments were the whole point. On a grey Sunday afternoon, Deborah stood in her laundry room holding a basket of towels she did not need to fold yet. Outside, rain tapped the window in a steady rhythm. The house smelled like detergent and warm fabric, a clean domestic smell that usually meant she was doing something right. For 35 years, Deborah's life ran on lists. Things to do, places to be, people to help. She raised children, hosted holidays, volunteered for school events, and kept a mental inventory of what everyone needed. Being useful became her posture. She moved through the days the way a person moves through a crowded hallway, always making room for someone else. When retirement came, friends told her she would finally rest. Deborah smiled and agreed. Rest sounded like something you earned after years of holding everything together. But the first months did not feel like a reward. They felt like being left behind after a long race. The phone stopped ringing. The calendar opened into empty squares. She would finish the dishes and then stand at the sink, waiting for another obligation to appear. It was as if her hands still expected the next task to arrive on schedule. Deborah tried to fill the quiet with activity. She reorganized closets. She cleaned out drawers that had already been cleaned. She moved furniture, and then moved it back. She kept working at the house the way she used to work at life, as if motion alone could keep the mind steady. Then one day she realized the house was as clean as it could reasonably be. There was nothing urgent left to fix. The emptiness did not become peaceful. It became visible. She carried the towels into the hallway and paused beside a framed photo from years ago. A summer beach trip. Her husband laughing in the bright light, holding a plastic cup like it contained the secret to life. Deborah looked at the photograph and felt a familiar regret rise in her. Quiet and persistent. Not regret that she loved him. Not regret that they built a life. Regret that she spent too many years managing the life instead of noticing it. When he was alive, he sometimes asked her to sit outside with him at night. Just sit. Deborah would say she would join him after she finished something. She would finish one thing, then another. She would eventually step outside, but often late. Her mind still tied to the inside of the house. She thought she had time. Later arrived as absence. Later arrived as a photo on a wall. Standing there with towels in her arms, Deborah realized regret is not always about major mistakes. Sometimes it is about the softness that was delayed, the evenings that could have been slower, the small ordinary moments that were traded away because she believed usefulness was the same as love. That afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table and did not reach for her phone. She let the rain continue without turning it into background noise. She listened to the house, a pipe clicking softly, the refrigerator humming, the quiet air of a room that did not require her to earn her place. Over time, Deborah began to practice stillness like someone practicing a new skill, slowly, with resistance, then with relief. She started taking short walks with no destination. She sat on the porch for 10 minutes and allowed the minutes to be empty. Regret taught her a simple truth. Independence can become isolation if it is used as armor. Being busy can become a kind of hiding. And rest is not something that arrives automatically when work ends. Rest is something a person learns to allow. The towels could wait. The day could hold quiet without collapsing. Deborah made tea and sat down again. For a moment, she was not a manager of life. She was simply a person inside it. In earlier years, Deborah thought calm was something that came after everything was handled. Now she saw that everything is never fully handled. There is always another errand, another message, another small disorder waiting at the edge of the day. The only change that mattered was the choice to stop feeding it all her best attention. The rain eased into a softer sound. Light shifted on the floor as clouds moved past. Deborah noticed the simple motion of time passing without being chased. It felt unfamiliar, and then it felt honest. The day did not need to be productive to be real. Later, regrets do not always demand big changes. Sometimes they ask for a small return, a chair pulled into the sun, a phone left on the counter. A quiet hour protected the way a person protects something fragile. At 6:10 in the morning, Marcus sat in his parked car outside a gym he no longer felt drawn to enter. The building was lit bright and clean behind big windows. Posters showed smiling people in motion, treadmills moving in place, bodies doing their work, steady and relentless. Marcus had joined this gym in his 30s. Back then, he wore pain like an accessory. He pushed through injuries. He ignored the small warnings. He treated rest like weakness and treated his body like a tool that would never wear out. In his 40s, the weight came slowly. Not enough to shock him, just enough to signal that the effortless years were ending. He corrected it the way he corrected everything. More discipline, more rules, more control. He counted steps. He tracked numbers. He built routines that looked impressive on paper. His friends admired him. He looked like someone who had mastered himself. But mastery has a price when it is built on fear. By 62, Marcus had learned that the body changes no matter how organized the calendar is. His knees complained after long walks. His shoulders tightened more easily. Sleep became lighter. Recovery took longer. The body did not betray him. It simply asked to be treated differently. The regret was subtle. It was not about missing workouts. It was about the years he treated his body as an opponent. It was about the way he punished himself for being human. He looked down at his hands on the steering wheel and remembered being young enough to recover quickly. He remembered carrying heavy things without thinking. He remembered the careless confidence of assuming health would stay, because it always had. Now he understood something quieter. Health is not a possession. It is a practice. And the practice is not only exercise. It is sleep. It is gentleness. It is choosing to stop performing toughness when nobody asked for a performance. Marcus turned the key and drove away from the gym. He drove toward a small park near the river. He parked and stepped out into cold air that felt clean against his face. The trail was nearly empty. A few birds moved between bare branches. The water made a soft sound over stones. He walked slowly, not as training, not as punishment, but as a way of staying close to his own life. Regret about the body is rarely about vanity. It is about freedom. Being able to lift a box without planning for consequences. Being able to sleep without discomfort. Being able to move without bargaining with pain. Marcus had spent years treating his body like a project with an end date. Now, He wanted to treat it like a companion that would stay with him only if he stopped trying to dominate it. As he walked, he noticed his breathing. He noticed the way his shoulders dropped when he stopped forcing speed. He noticed how calm arrived when he stopped chasing an ideal version of himself. Later in life, regret often teaches that the smallest signals matter, the tightness ignored, the fatigue dismissed, the strain laughed off. A person can spend decades building discipline and still miss the simple practice of listening. Marcus walked one loop and then another. The morning light grew slightly stronger. When he returned to the car, he felt neither triumphant nor defeated. He felt steady. The body he had was not the body he used to have. It was still his life, and the life inside it was worth treating with care. He thought about his father, who had worked hard and slept little, and spoke rarely about the cost. Marcus used to believe that endurance was the highest virtue. Keep going. Ignore discomfort. Do not slow down. In younger years, the body cooperates with that philosophy. In later years, the body begins to ask for a different kind of strength. There is strength in stopping, strength in eating slowly, strength in walking at a pace that allows the mind to soften, strength in leaving space in the day that is not filled with improvement. Marcus had spent too much time treating rest as something to deserve. The regret came from the realization that rest is not a reward. Rest is maintenance for a life that still has years left in it. On the drive home, he stopped at a small grocery store and bought fruit and bread. He returned to his kitchen and made a simple breakfast. He sat down and ate without watching anything. He let the morning be plain. The day did not need to be conquered. It needed to be lived. Later, when he cleaned the plate, Marcus noticed that he did it without hurry. The small shift felt like relief. It was the kind of change that does not show up in a photo, but changes the texture of a life. Sharon still went to the party. It was a small gathering at a neighbor's house, the kind with folding chairs and music kept low enough to allow conversation without effort. Sharon had almost stayed home, not because she disliked people, because she had learned, over years, to treat her own comfort as optional. At 59, Sharon understood that much of her life had been shaped by a quiet habit of shrinking. She dressed for other people's expectations. She smiled to prevent awkwardness. She stayed longer than she wanted to stay. She laughed at jokes that made her feel slightly embarrassed. None of it was dramatic. It was just the slow way a person can disappear without noticing. On the day of the party, she opened her closet and looked at the clothes the way she always did, searching for something that would look acceptable. Then she paused. She chose what she liked. A sweater that felt soft instead of tight. Shoes she could stand in without pretending not to notice the pain. She brushed her hair and looked at her reflection with an unfamiliar tenderness. The regret she carried was not about looking older. It was about the years she pinched herself into discomfort, as if discomfort was the entry fee for belonging. When she arrived, she greeted people warmly and took a seat near the edge of the room where she could see without being swallowed by the noise. Faces blurred into familiar shapes. A few people laughed. Someone refilled a bowl of chips. The evening had the gentle looseness of ordinary community. A friend named Judy came over and hugged her with the ease of someone who did not need to prove anything. Judy had known Sharon for decades. They had shared school drop-offs and quick conversations in grocery store aisles. They had watched each other age in slow increments, as if years were being revealed through small details. Sharon felt the hug settle her, not in a sentimental way, in a grounding way. in the way a simple physical gesture can remind a person that they still exist. She noticed how easily Judy moved through the room. Judy did not apologize for taking up space. She did not narrate her choices or soften her opinions for safety. She was simply present. Sharon had always admired that without knowing what it meant. Standing there with Judy's warmth still on her shoulders, Sharon realized how often she had confused politeness with self-erasure. Regret, at this age, often contains a quiet anger that never found a voice. Not rage, not confrontation, just the steady disappointment of realizing how many small moments were spent managing other people's comfort. Sharon walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood by the counter for a moment. The tile was cool under her hand. The light above the sink was too bright. She watched bubbles rise in the glass and felt her mind slow. When Judy returned, Sharon stayed calm and ordinary. She did not perform extra cheerfulness. She did not force small talk when silence felt better. The friendship did not collapse. It held. Later, Sharon stepped outside for a few minutes and looked at the sky. The air was cold enough to sharpen her attention. The neighborhood was quiet. She could hear distant traffic and the soft sound of music through a closed door. She understood something simple. She did not need to be the easiest person in every room. She could be a whole person. The change was not loud. It was private. It was a small decision, repeated, the way a life becomes different over time. When she went back inside, Sharon stayed another half hour and then left when her body said it was time. The choice felt clean, not defensive, not rude, just honest. Later, regrets are often shaped by this one truth. A person can be kind without being absent. A person can belong without abandoning themselves. On the drive home, Sharon remembered her mother, Louise, who aged with a kind of quiet compliance. Louise rarely complained. She rarely asked for anything. She folded herself into the needs of others so completely that by the time she was older, nobody knew what she wanted, not even Louise. As a teenager, Sharon thought her mother was simply selfless. Later, she understood that selflessness can become a habit that leaves a person with no clear shape of their own. Sharon parked in her driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. The house across the street glowed with one porch light. The street was still. She felt the calm satisfaction of having lived the evening instead of enduring it. She went inside, hung her coat, and left her shoes by the door. Her feet felt grateful. The night did not need to be memorable. It needed to be real. And for the first time in a long time, Sharon felt that she had remained present with herself the whole way through. On a Tuesday morning, Gillian stood in her kitchen holding her car keys and staring at the door as if it required courage to open it. She was 65. Her husband had already left for work. The house was quiet. The day was open, and she did not know what to do with it. In her working years, Gillian dreamed of mornings like this. She imagined retirement as a warm blanket, slow hours. No deadlines, no urgent messages, no need to hurry. She told herself she would finally breathe. Then retirement arrived, and she discovered that breathing does not automatically happen when time becomes available. Breathing happens when a person stops bracing. Gillian had spent decades bracing for bills, bracing for the children's needs, bracing for work stress, bracing for the next problem that might arrive uninvited. Her mind lived in the future the way a guard dog lives on alert, always listening. Now the future looked blank, not frightening, just empty in a way that made her uneasy. She sat at the table with coffee and scrolled her phone. She refreshed headlines. She checked email. She watched short videos she did not care about. Time passed. The coffee cooled. The restlessness remained. Later life regret can include the realization that distraction becomes a habit. Not because it feels good, because it keeps a person from hearing what they do not know how to handle. At noon, Gillian stood at the sink and washed a cup that was already clean. Her hands moved out of reflex. The mind stayed restless. In the afternoon, she received a simple message from a friend named Monica. Monica was not dramatic. Monica did not demand constant contact. She was the kind of friend who stayed present without chasing. They had been close in their 40s, when the children were young and life felt like a series of deadlines. As the years passed, Gillian let the friendship soften into occasional holiday greetings. She did not decide to lose the friendship. She simply treated it as optional. Now she understood what optional becomes when time continues. Optional becomes rare. Rare becomes gone. Gillian agreed to meet Monica for a walk in a small park. The trees were bare. The air was cold. Their breath appeared in faint white clouds. They walked side by side without trying to entertain each other. Monica talked about ordinary things. Gillian did the same. The conversation had no agenda, and that was the relief of it. Ordinary did not feel empty. Ordinary felt human. As they walked, Gillian felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly. It was not a cure. It was not a breakthrough. It was the body remembering that connection is a kind of regulation. Later regrets often include the years people spent acting like they were fine when they were not. It is exhausting to pretend. It drains attention in the same way a leak drains a bucket. Monica did not try to fix Gillian's mood. She simply stayed near. The friendship held its shape without pressure. When the walk ended, Gillian drove home slowly. The streets looked the same as they always did. The houses, the traffic lights, the winter lawns. But the inside of the day felt different. She made dinner that evening and noticed she was less restless. She put away dish without rushing. She folded a small pile of laundry without resentment. The tasks did not change. The feeling inside them changed. Gillian realized that a life can become quiet in a way that feels like relief, or quiet in a way that feels like exile. The difference is often one steady relationship, maintained with small, ordinary contact. Regret taught her a simple truth. Friendships do not vanish in one dramatic moment. They vanish through neglect that feels harmless at the time. She sent Monica a short message before bed. Nothing emotional, nothing heavy. Just a small note of thanks for the walk. Then she turned off the light and let the quiet hold her, instead of accusing her. In the dark, Gillian listened to the house. A faint creak in the hallway. The heat turning on and off. A distant car passing. She noticed that the sounds did not feel lonely. They felt like a room being occupied by a life still in motion. She thought about the years when she ran from task to task, telling herself she would reconnect with people when things slowed down. The slowing had arrived. The reconnecting still required choice. The next day, she wrote Monica's name on a small notepad by the phone, not as a reminder of obligation, but as a reminder of what matters. A short walk, a short call, a small shared hour. The kind of thing that seems minor until it is missing. Douglas had always taken pride in being useful. At 70, he still woke before sunrise. He made the bed with tight corners, as if neatness could hold the day together. He checked the weather, checked the news, checked his calendar, even when the calendar had nothing on it. The habit of readiness remained long after the work that required it. Most mornings he drove to a diner a few miles from his house. It was not a special place. The coffee was plain. The pancakes were ordinary. The booths were worn in the corners where thousands of people had shifted their weight over the years. Douglas liked it because nobody expected anything from him there. He could sit with a mug and watch the slow movement of the room. A cook wiping down the counter. A server refilling a sugar jar. An older couple reading the paper side by side without speaking. One morning, he saw Arlene at a table near the window. Arlene was a few years younger. She was the kind of person who noticed details. She did not talk to fill silence. She sat with herself easily, the way some people do after they have stopped trying to impress. Douglas nodded to her and sat down nearby. Over time, they began to share the same quiet routine, a brief greeting, a few minutes of small conversation, then long stretches where they simply sat and watched the day arrive. Douglas had spent most of his adult life treating rest as something earned. He worked overtime. He fixed things around the house. He stayed busy, even on days off. When he sat down, he felt guilty, as if sitting meant he was wasting something. Now, with his working years behind him, he realized that he had not only been working, he had been avoiding stillness. Stillness made him feel exposed. In stillness, the mind notices what it has postponed. Old grief, old irritations, old loneliness, the feeling that time is moving faster than it used to. So Douglas had stayed in motion. Motion felt like control. Sitting in the diner, he watched a man at the counter stir his coffee slowly, as if each small circle mattered. Douglas noticed how calm the man looked, how unhurried. Douglas realized he wanted that kind of calm, not because it looked impressive, but because it looked livable. Arlene said something simple about the morning being cold and clear. Douglas nodded and felt his shoulders relax. He had always assumed rest was the opposite of work. He had assumed rest was what happened after the work was finished. But the work is never fully finished. The house can always be cleaned again. The yard can always be trimmed again. The inbox can always be checked again. A person can spend their entire life maintaining everything and still miss the feeling of being here. Later in life, regret often arrives as that missing feeling. Douglas began to experiment with rest as a daily practice, not long vacations, not dramatic retreats, small, deliberate pauses, sitting on the porch for 10 minutes, taking a short walk without turning it into exercise, drinking coffee without reading anything at the same time. He was surprised by how difficult it felt at first. The mind kept searching for a task, as if meaning could only be earned through productivity. But after a while, the searching eased. On a Tuesday afternoon, Douglas sat in his living room and listened to the quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked. The light moved slowly across the floor. Nothing important happened. And yet the hour felt full. When he returned to the diner the next morning, Arlene looked at him and noticed something different. Douglas did not say much about it. He simply held his mug with both hands and watched the day arrive. The lesson was not dramatic. It was steady. Rest was not the opposite of work. Rest was the thing that allowed the life around the work to be felt. Regret did not vanish, but it softened into something useful. A reminder that there is still time to live the hours, not just fill them. After breakfast, Douglas drove home the long way, past a small pond where thin ice formed at the edges. A man walked a dog on the far side of the water. The dog stopped to sniff every patch of grass with the seriousness of a scientist. Douglas watched for a moment and felt an unexpected warmth. The dog was not hurrying toward anything. It was simply living inside the walk. At home, Douglas left the television off. He washed the mug and placed it carefully in the cabinet. The small act felt satisfying in a way that did not depend on being praised. The day belonged to him, and that belonging felt like the start of something quieter and more lasting. Nina was 67 when she noticed she had become known for keeping things smooth. In her family, she was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who brought extra napkins, the one who turned disagreements into jokes before anyone raised a voice. People described her as easy to be around, calm, pleasant, safe. They meant it as praise. Nina began to notice how tired that praise made her. The awareness arrived during a family dinner at her niece's house. The table was crowded with plates and quiet laughter. Someone poured wine. Someone passed bread. The room felt warm in a practical way, filled with familiar faces and small routines. Nina watched herself the way a person watches a habit in motion. She smiled at the right moments. She nodded at stories that repeated every year. She laughed when the laughter arrived, even when she felt nothing rise in her. There was no crisis. There was no fight. It was the softness of ordinary gathering. And yet, Nina felt a strange emptiness under the surface, as if she had been performing herself for so long that the real self had grown quiet. She learned the habit early. As a child, she lived in a house where moods shifted quickly. Nina became skilled at reading the room. She learned to sense tension before it spoke. She learned to do small things that lowered the temperature. A joke, a compliment, a quick change of subject. It kept the peace. It also taught her that comfort mattered more than honesty. In marriage, Nina was the first to apologize, the first to compromise, the first to take responsibility for everyone else's mood. Her husband loved her and trusted her steadiness. Over time, he relied on it without noticing what it cost. After he died, Nina discovered how much of her identity had been built around being needed. Without a person to stabilize, she felt slightly unmoored. Now, sitting at dinners with family, Nina felt the same old role rise automatically. The peacekeeper, the one who absorbs discomfort so no one else has to. Later life regret often includes the roles people perform so well, they forgot they had a self underneath them. After the dinner, Nina drove home in silence. The streetlights passed in slow intervals. Her hands stayed steady on the wheel. The night was ordinary. The feeling inside her was not dramatic. It was simply the quiet ache of realizing she had been disappearing in small ways for years. The next week, a relative invited her to brunch. Nina almost said yes automatically. Then she paused. She pictured the familiar pattern. Nina showing up, smiling, listening, smoothing, leaving slightly drained. For the first time, she let herself choose differently. She declined the invitation in a simple way, without adding reasons to make it easier for everyone else. The choice felt strange. Her heart beat faster, as if she had done something dangerous. Nothing terrible happened. The world did not collapse. Her family continued as it always had. But Nina noticed something important. The nervousness she felt was not a sign she had done something wrong. It was a sign she had stepped out of a habit. That evening, she sat on her couch with a blanket over her knees and listened to the quiet house. She did not rush to distract herself. She let the discomfort fade into calm. She felt her own presence return, small and steady, Regret had not arrived to punish her. It arrived to show her where she had been absent. In the days that followed, Nina practiced a simpler way of living. She answered messages when she felt ready, not immediately. She left gatherings a little earlier. She allowed herself to be quiet in rooms without explaining it. The changes were nearly invisible to everyone else. They were obvious to her. Later in life, the most important boundaries are often quiet ones, the kind that preserve a person's attention, the kind that makes space for a life that feels like it belongs to the person living it. One morning, Nina drove to a small library and walked the aisles slowly. She chose a novel at random and carried it to a table near a window. Sunlight fell across the wood in a thin, warm stripe. She read for 20 minutes without checking the time. The act felt simple, almost childish, and yet it felt like proof that her attention could be used for her own life. When she returned home, she made soup and ate it slowly. No television, no phone in her lap. The quiet felt like a room she had been locked out of for years, and now had finally entered again. Louis met Ray every Friday morning for breakfast at a quiet place with booths that faced the windows. It was not a tradition they ever announced. It just happened through repetition, the way a life form patterns when nobody tries to design them. Louis was 68. Ray was about the same. They had been friends since their 20s, back when weekends were loud and plans felt endless. Over time, the friendship narrowed into these mornings: coffee, eggs, a slow review of ordinary life. Louis liked the routine because it did not ask him to talk about anything complicated. Ray, on the other hand, had become more reflective with age. He talked about his daughter, Sienna, and how quickly she had grown into adulthood. He talked about waking up in the middle of the night and feeling the quiet weight of years. He talked about missing people who used to be part of daily life. Louis listened. He cared. But he often redirected. He made a joke. He brought the conversation back to safe ground. Not because he was cold, because he did not know how to stay inside softer feelings without becoming uncomfortable. It was a habit Louis learned early. In his family, emotions were treated like private problems. You handled them on your own. You did not burden anyone. You stayed strong by staying quiet. The habit worked. It also built distance. That morning, Ray sat across from him and stirred his coffee slowly. The light outside was pale. Cars moved past the window with the steady indifference of time. Ray's face looked tired in a way that was not dramatic, just older, more exposed. Louis felt something loosen in his chest. He realized he had spent decades performing toughness, and the performance had cost him comfort. Later in life, regret is often not about failing to be strong. It is about being strong in a way that blocks closeness. Louis wanted a different kind of strength, the kind that allows warmth, the kind that allows the truth to sit on the table without being pushed away. He did not deliver a speech. He did not turn the moment into a big confession. He simply slowed down. He let a silence arrive without rushing to fill it. He stayed present. As the breakfast continued, Ray spoke more gently. Louis stayed with the words instead of steering away. The room stayed calm. The friendship did not become heavy. It became honest. When they paid the bill and walked out to the parking lot, the air was cold enough to make their breath visible. They stood by their cars for a moment, neither in a hurry to leave. The pause felt unfamiliar, like a small door opening. Louis drove home and noticed how quiet the road felt. Not empty, quiet in a way that allowed thought. He considered the years when he had avoided saying anything too tender. He told himself it was dignity. He told himself it was privacy. Now he understood that it had also been fear. Fear of awkwardness. Fear of being seen. At home, Louis washed his hands and looked at the kitchen window. The glass held a faint reflection of his face, older and softer than the face he remembered. He felt a quiet relief. He did not have to be impressive anymore. Over the next weeks, Louis began to practice small acts of openness, a short call to his sister, a message to his adult son, Carter, asking if they could meet for lunch, a longer pause when someone spoke about something tender. None of it changed his personality overnight. It simply made the days feel less sealed shut. Peaceful acceptance is not pretending life is easy. It is letting life be human without hardening against it. Louis realized that emotional honesty did not require drama. It required steadiness. It required the willingness to tolerate a small discomfort so something warmer could exist. Regret had taught him that closeness is not automatic. It is built from small moments where a person chooses to stay present instead of retreating. On the next Friday morning, Louis arrived at the diner on time. He sat down across from Ray. The coffee came. The window showed the same pale day. The friendship continued. Quiet and ordinary. And for Louis, that was enough. Ordinary, at this stage, was often the most valuable thing left. Later that afternoon, Louis walked through a grocery store and noticed how many people moved quickly, as if speed itself could protect them. He moved more slowly. He let himself wait in line without impatience. He let the minutes exist. In the evening, he sat on the porch for a short while and listened to the neighborhood settle. A dog barked once and stopped. A door closed down the street. The night air felt clean. He thought about the simple truth he had learned late. The people who matter do not require perfect words. They require presence. The thought did not make him sad. It made him steady. Erica kept a notebook in the top drawer of her desk, and inside it she tracked money the way a person tracks weather. She had learned to do it young. Her parents argued about bills. The house felt tense at the end of every month. Erica decided early that she would never live with that feeling. She would be prepared. She would be careful. She would build a life that could not be shaken by surprise. By 61, her preparation looked impressive. The mortgage was nearly paid. The retirement account had grown steadily. The pantry was always stocked. The car was maintained on schedule. The house had a quiet sense of order, as if nothing inside it could fall apart. Friends called her responsible. They meant it as praise. But one night, Erica sat at her kitchen table and felt a regret that did not match her achievements. It came as a strange emptiness, a sense that the years had been spent guarding against loss so diligently that she had forgotten to notice what she already had. Erica had a partner named Malcolm. They were not dramatic people. Their marriage was steady, built on routines that worked. They ate dinner together most nights. They kept the house clean. They helped their adult daughter when she needed something. But Erica realized that many of their best evenings had been postponed. Not cancelled, postponed. They postponed trips because flights cost money. They postponed dinners out because it seemed unnecessary. They postponed small luxuries because discipline felt safer than pleasure. The regret was not about travel. It was about the habit behind the decisions. A person can delay joy for practical reasons and still become trapped by delay. One Saturday, Malcolm suggested they drive to a nearby town and walk along the water. The cost would be small. The time would be simple. Erica almost said no automatically. The notebook in her drawer had trained her reflexes. Then she stopped. She remembered how often she had promised herself she would relax once everything was secure. She remembered how often security kept moving like a horizon. So she said yes. They drove in quiet comfort. Winter fields passed by the windows. The radio stayed low. When they arrived, the waterfront was nearly empty. The air was cold enough to feel sharp. Erica and Malcolm walked slowly, hands in pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. They stopped at a small bench and sat without speaking. The water moved in steady patterns. The light on the surface shifted with the clouds. Nothing important happened. And yet Erica felt something loosen. She realized that the kind of peace she wanted could not be purchased or scheduled. It could only be allowed. Later regrets about money often have nothing to do with income. They have to do with attention. A person can spend decades building safety and still feel anxious because anxiety is not always solved by numbers. Anxiety is often solved by learning how to be present without bracing. That afternoon, Erica and Malcolm went into a small cafe and shared soup and bread. The meal was ordinary. The warmth of the room felt gentle. Erica watched Malcolm's face while he ate and noticed the lines around his eyes, the way time had shaped him without asking permission. She felt a quiet sadness for the years she treated life like a future problem to solve. When they returned home, Erica opened her notebook out of habit and then closed it again. She did not need to prove discipline to herself that night. Instead, she lit a lamp and sat on the couch with a blanket. Malcolm read a book beside her. The room was quiet. The day had been small. The smallness was the point. Later in life, regret often teaches that preparation is necessary, but it is not the meaning of living. The meaning is found in the ordinary moments that are allowed to feel like enough. Erica went to bed that night with a steadier mind. The money was still there. The carefulness was still there. But something else had arrived too. A softer trust that a life does not have to be earned every day to be worth living. In the morning, Erica made a small list that had nothing to do with budgeting. Call an old friend. Take a walk with Malcolm after lunch. Buy flowers for the kitchen table. Leave space for one pleasant thing each day. The list felt almost rebellious. Not because it was irresponsible, but because it refused the belief that joy must wait until everything is perfect. Later regrets are often a reminder that time is a currency too. And unlike money, time does not earn interest when it is saved. It only passes. In the early evening, the neighborhood quieted the way it always did, slowly and without ceremony. A porch light turned on across the street. A car door closed somewhere nearby. A dog walked past with its owner, moving at the same calm pace every night. The ordinary world kept running its gentle circuits. Inside his house, Adrian sat at the table with a blank piece of paper and a pen. He was 64 and recently retired from a job that once defined him. For years he told himself he did not need hobbies because work was enough. Work gave him identity. Work gave him purpose. Work gave him an easy answer when someone asked what he did. Now that the work had ended, Adrian felt the strange silence underneath that identity. It was not depression. It was not panic. It was the simple fact that his days were no longer structured by obligation. Without structure, he could finally hear himself. He had been avoiding that for years. Adrian looked at the blank paper and tried to write down what he regretted. The word regret felt harsh, like a moral failure, but he reminded himself that regret is often just delayed clarity. He wrote slowly. He regretted postponing trips he could have taken. He regretted staying late at work when nobody would remember it. He regretted being polite when he should have been honest. He regretted holding his tongue around people he loved. He regretted thinking he had time without noticing time was already being spent. When he finished, the page held a handful of plain sentences. Nothing poetic, nothing dramatic, just the truth in simple words. Adrian sat back and looked at what he had written. The regret did not crush him. It settled him. He realized that regret, when approached calmly, can become a guide rather than a punishment. It shows a person where their attention has been leaking away. It shows a person which decisions were made out of fear rather than love. It shows a person what matters before it is too late to act on it. He tore the page out and folded it. He did not throw it away. He placed it inside a book on his shelf, not as a confession, but as a marker, a reminder to stay awake. Then he stood up and walked to the living room window. He looked out at the quiet street and felt a steady gratitude for the fact that he was still here. The mistakes were not the end of the story. Later in life, regret becomes most painful when it turns into a story about being finished. But a person is not finished simply because they see the truth late. Seeing the truth late is still seeing it. Adrian made a cup of tea and sat down in a chair near the lamp. He did not turn on the television. He did not reach for his phone. He let the room stay quiet. He thought of the people he cared about. His sister, Dina, who lived a few hours away. His old friend, Marcus, who always meant well, but never called. His neighbor, Sharon, who waved politely and then disappeared inside her house. Adrian understood something ordinary and useful. The remedy for regret is rarely a grand change. It is small contact, repeated. A call made today instead of planned for next week. A walk taken before the weather becomes an excuse. A boundary held without apology. A moment of stillness allowed without guilt. He finished the tea slowly. He felt the warmth settle in his stomach. The day felt complete in a quiet way. Outside, another porch light turned on. The street looked calm. Time continued. Adrian did not promise himself he would fix everything. He promised something smaller. He would pay attention. After 50, the life a person wants is often built from that one choice. Pay attention. Stay present. Let the hours belong to the life, not the other way around. The room stayed quiet. Adrian sat with the quiet and let it be enough. The next morning, Adrian woke early out of habit. The house was dim. He walked to the kitchen and made coffee, then sat at the table again. The folded page was still tucked in the book on the shelf, a small reminder that his mind had not invented the insight in a single emotional moment. It was real. It would still be real when the day became busy again. He looked out the window and watched the sky lighten. He noticed the simple way dawn arrives, one shade at a time. He felt a calm gratitude that the day did not demand anything from him yet. Regret had finally taught him something he wished he had known earlier. The point of living is not to be flawless. The point is to be awake for the life that is already happening. Adrian took a slow sip of coffee and let the morning remain quiet. The story of his life was still being written, not in dramatic chapters, but in small, ordinary choices that could begin right now. At the edge of a small community garden, Naomi stood with a pair of worn gloves tucked into her coat pocket and a paper cup of coffee warming her fingers. The ground was hard with winter, the raised beds empty except for a few stubborn stems left behind by someone who had not finished cleaning up. A row of tool sheds leaned slightly, their doors marked with names written in fading paint. Naomi had signed up for the plot 10 years earlier. She had paid the fee every spring. She had walked past the gate most weeks, sometimes slowing down, sometimes stopping to look through the fence. She had imagined tomatoes climbing a trellis and basil spilling out of a corner bed. She had imagined carrying a bowl of food across the street to her neighbor, Evelyn, who lived alone and always said she missed the taste of real summer. Naomi had even bought seed packets once, tucked them into a kitchen drawer, and watched them expire, while the drawer filled with other small intentions. In those years, Naomi had not been idle. She worked late at the library through staffing shortages. She helped her sister, Dana, through a divorce that took 2 years to settle. She drove her grandson, Miles, to school twice a week and kept a spare backpack at her house in case he forgot something important. She made soups when people were sick. She sent birthday cards on time. Her days were full of usefulness. The garden stayed an idea. The plot stayed empty. Each season, she told herself there would be time. The morning she finally unlocked the gate, she did not feel brave. She felt tired of postponing. She had turned 71 the week before. Nothing dramatic happened on the birthday. No sudden crisis. Just a small shift in the way time felt. As if it had stopped being a long hallway and become a short set of steps. Evelyn was already there, kneeling carefully by a bed she had covered with straw. Evelyn was older than Naomi by a few years. Her hands moved slowly but without hesitation, as if they knew what to do, even when the body protested. She had a small radio sitting on the ground, turned low enough that the music sounded like a distant room. Naomi watched her for a minute and felt a quiet embarrassment. Not the sharp kind that burns, the softer kind that arrives with honesty. A decade of days had gone by, and Naomi had not used one of them to build the simple thing she said she wanted. She walked to her plot and set down the coffee. The soil looked grey and packed. She could already feel the ache that would come later in her wrists. She did not like discomfort. That was part of the pattern. She had spent years arranging her life to avoid small discomforts, then wondered why the seasons felt thin. Naomi began by pulling out the dead stems one at a time. The work was plain. The air was cold. The garden did not offer inspiration. It offered only the immediate task. The quiet proof of hands moving and time being used for something that could not be rushed. After half an hour, she had cleared one corner bed. It did not look like much, but she felt something settle in her chest, the sense of a promise finally being kept. Not a promise to anyone else, a promise to her own attention. Later, when she stood to stretch her back, she noticed Evelyn watching with a faint smile, not approving, not judging, simply noticing. Naomi thought of all the times she had believed she needed permission to begin, as if starting late required an excuse. Naomi realized that much of regret is not about failure. It is about delay. A life can be full of decent reasons for delay. The reasons still add up to the same outcome. By noon, she had 2 beds cleared and a small pile of weeds at her feet. She wrote a few notes in a pocket notebook. Seeds to buy, compost to add, a reminder to bring Miles here in April and let him dig with his hands, a reminder to ask Dana to come along and have coffee on the bench by the gate. When she locked the gate to leave, she did not feel as if she had fixed anything. She felt as if she had stepped back into her own life. The garden would still take time. Growth would still be slow. The point was not the harvest. The point was that Naomi could finally see the cost of waiting for the perfect season. The regret came from all the ordinary mornings she let pass. The relief came from choosing one ordinary morning and staying with it. On the sidewalk outside the garden, Naomi paused and looked back through the fence once more. The beds were still mostly bare. The change was small enough that no one would call it a turning point. It was only a beginning, and beginnings are often quiet. In a modest living room with framed school photos lining the mantel, Hector sat at a table covered in envelopes. The afternoon light fell across the paper in a way that made each crease and stamp feel heavier. Hector was 74 and newly retired from a job that had always given him a reason to postpone his personal life. Even in retirement, he woke early, made coffee, and looked for something urgent to do. The envelopes were from his sister, Marisol. She wrote often. Her handwriting was neat and slightly slanted, the kind that suggested patience. Hector had always meant to answer. He would open the letters, read them once, then fold them back into the envelope and set them on a shelf beside the phone. A response required time and quiet. Hector often told himself he would write when he felt more settled. Marisol lived 3 states away. Hector had not seen her in 6 years. There were holidays when he promised he would visit. Then he found reasons not to. A project at work, a repair needed at the house, a week where his back hurt. The reasons were not false. They were simply convenient. And convenience can become a habit. Hector told himself that not calling was a kind of restraint. He did not want to bother Marisol. He did not want to arrive in her day like a demand. The truth was simpler. Calling required Hector to be present, and presence made him feel exposed. Distance felt safer, because it asked nothing of him except the ability to stay busy. Hector remembered being children in a narrow row house where Marisol was the one who noticed details. She kept small collections of things, smooth stones from the creek, buttons from old coats, paper dolls she drew herself. Hector was the one who wanted to move forward. He left home first. He took pride in independence, in not needing much. Over time, that pride hardened into a way of living that made it difficult to admit he missed anyone. That day, Hector opened an envelope dated 9 months earlier. Inside was a photograph of Marisol holding her first great-grandchild, a small boy named Adrian. Marisol's face looked joyful and tired. The baby's hand was curled around her finger. Hector stared at the photograph and felt regret arrive with quiet force. It was not about missing a milestone. It was about how easily he let distance become normal. He had treated family as a stable background, as if relationships could remain intact without attention. He placed the photograph on the table and looked around the room. The house was orderly. The bills were paid. The lawn was trimmed. Hector had done many things correctly, but none of those tasks could substitute for the one thing he kept neglecting, which was reaching out while there was still time for easy closeness. Hector made a list on the back of an envelope. Call Marisol, write down questions, ask about Adrian. Ask about her porch garden. Ask about the neighbor she mentioned in the last letter. He realized how strange it was to need a list for intimacy. The list existed because he had allowed the muscle to weaken. He lifted the phone and dialed. The first ring made his heart race. The second ring felt like a verdict. On the third ring, Marisol answered. Hector said her name. That was all he managed at first. Marisol went quiet for a moment. Then her voice softened. They did not solve the past in one call. They did not speak in long speeches. They talked in small pieces. How the weather had been. How the roof repair went. How Adrian had started making noises that sounded like laughter. Hector listened more than he spoke. He felt how much he had missed the ordinary texture of her life. When they hung up, Hector sat with the phone in his hand and felt both relief and grief. Relief that the bridge still held. Grief for how long he had waited to cross it. Regret often arrives in later years as a simple arithmetic. A person counts the years of silence and realizes they were made from days that seemed harmless at the time. Hector placed the photograph into a new frame and set it on the table where he would see it each morning. Not as decoration, as a reminder that closeness is built by showing up in small ways, again and again, before distance becomes a permanent arrangement. That evening, he cleared the shelf where the unopened envelopes had been gathering dust. He did not throw them away. He stacked them in order and placed them beside a fresh pad of paper and a pen. The arrangement looked simple. It felt like a decision. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Priya stood in the aisle of a grocery store holding a jar of pasta sauce and staring at the label as if it contained an answer. The store was nearly empty. The music was low. The ordinary calm should have made the decision easy. Instead, Priya felt tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with groceries. Priya had been known for her certainty. At work, she was the person who caught mistakes and corrected plans. In her family, she was the one who remembered facts, dates, and what people promised. She carried competence like armor. It made her dependable. It also made her difficult, in a specific way she had not wanted to see. Priya learned the habit early. Her parents ran a small business, and money was always close to the edge. Mistakes had consequences. A missed bill meant a late fee. A wrong order meant a week of tension in the house. Priya became the child who double-checked. She counted. She organized. She remembered. Adults praised her for being responsible, and Priya absorbed the praise as identity. In marriage, she carried that identity too. Her husband, Dev, had joked for years that Priya kept the household running like an office. Dev did not mean it as an insult, but Priya could hear the fatigue under the humor. Even Dev, the person closest to her, sometimes looked relieved when she left the room, as if the air became easier. Her younger brother, Rohan, had stopped calling as often. He still attended family gatherings. He still sent polite messages on birthdays. But the warmth had thinned. Priya told herself he was busy. She told herself it was normal for siblings to drift. Then, 3 weeks earlier, Priya overheard her niece, Nina, talking to a friend on speakerphone. Nina spoke casually, not trying to hurt anyone. She said that Rohan did not like visiting because Priya always turned conversations into corrections. Priya stood in the doorway of the hallway and felt the sentence land with clean clarity. It was not an accusation. It was a description. Priya spent the next days watching herself. She noticed how quickly she interrupted. How often she offered a better version of someone else's story. How she treated small disagreements like puzzles to solve. The habit came from a good place. Priya wanted life to be accurate. She wanted people to be safe. She believed that being right prevented regret. But the habit was also a way of controlling uncertainty. It was easier to correct someone than to sit with the fact that relationships are messy and fragile. At 67, Priya began to see a pattern that had been invisible when time felt abundant. She had won arguments that did not matter. She had collected proof that no one asked for. She had protected her pride and paid for it with closeness. That morning in the grocery store, she put the jar back and picked a different one without comparing every ingredient. It was a small act, almost silly. It was practice. At home, she wrote a note and placed it beside the phone. It did not include a plan to explain herself. It included a single intention. Call Rohan. Listen. Let the conversation remain imperfect. When Priya called, Rohan answered. Priya could hear the surprise in the brief pause before he spoke. She began by asking about Nina's school, about a work project Rohan had mentioned months earlier. She did not interrupt. She did not correct. She let silence exist. After a few minutes, Priya admitted that she had been thinking about how she spoke to people. She said she did not want to keep being a person others had to brace themselves around. The words felt strange in her mouth, but they also felt true. Rohan did not respond with a dramatic reconciliation. He responded with a tired relief, as if he had been waiting for Priya to notice. They talked for half an hour, mostly about small things. When the call ended, Priya noticed she felt lighter, not because she had repaired everything, but because she had stopped defending herself. Regret can arrive late as an understanding that correctness is not the same as care. A person can be accurate and still be unkind. A person can be competent and still be lonely. Priya began practicing a different kind of strength. The strength of letting small errors pass. The strength of listening without polishing. The strength of choosing relationship over victory. One ordinary conversation at a time. Nothing about the change required a declaration. It required repetition. That was the quiet work of repair. In a small office above a car dealership, Glenn sat alone with a spreadsheet open on the screen. The numbers were familiar, almost comforting. Glenn had spent 40 years in sales management, the kind of job that rewarded alertness and punished rest. Even now, at 70, he found himself searching for the next metric to improve, the next inefficiency to correct, as if calm were a problem. His wife, Teresa, had moved through the house that morning without much conversation. She poured coffee, fed the dog, and left for an early appointment. Their marriage was not broken. It was simply thin from years of being treated like something that would always be there, waiting. Glenn remembered the first years when Teresa would sit at the kitchen table and tell him stories from her day. Glenn would listen for a minute, then glance at his phone, then say he needed to make a call. He told himself he was building security for both of them. He told himself the intense years were temporary. Temporary became a decade, then 2 decades. The house filled with new furniture and better appliances. Their savings grew. Glenn reached goals he had once imagined with hunger. Glenn and Teresa had raised a daughter, Callie, who was grown now and lived across downtown. Glenn attended the big events, the ones that were scheduled far in advance. But many smaller moments belonged to Teresa alone. The late-night fever, the school project that needed supplies, the quiet sadness when Callie did not get invited to a party. Glenn heard about those moments later, secondhand, when the urgency had already passed. He told himself he was present enough. He told himself that love could be proven. Now Glenn noticed something else. Callie called Teresa first, and Glenn second. Sometimes she did not call Glenn at all. The pattern did not feel like rejection. It felt like consequence. Then, one evening, Teresa stopped telling stories. It happened gradually. Glenn did not notice right away. Teresa began to talk more to her sister, Marlene. She joined a book club. She took long walks alone. She stopped waiting at the window for Glenn's car to pull in. Glenn assumed this meant she was independent. He took it as proof that she was fine. On the morning Glenn finally noticed, it was not an argument that revealed it. It was the quiet way Teresa looked past him as she gathered her keys. The look had no anger. It had distance. Glenn felt regret arrive as a physical sensation, a hollow space behind the ribs. He had pictured regret as remorse for a single mistake. He had not expected regret to feel like realizing a room had emptied while he was still in it. At lunch, Glenn drove to a park near the dealership and sat on a bench. The air smelled of wet leaves. A few older couples walked slowly along the path, their arms linked, their pace unhurried. Glenn watched them and felt a strange envy, not for romance, for ease. He thought about Teresa's face in their wedding photo, bright and unguarded. He thought about how many evenings he had chosen the glow of a dashboard and the urgency of work over the ordinary comfort of sitting in the living room with her. Glenn drove home earlier than usual. He set his phone on the counter and left it there. He washed his hands and walked into the den where Teresa was folding laundry. He did not begin with explanations. He began by asking if she wanted tea. He sat in the chair across from her and stayed. He listened to her talk about the book she was reading, about the neighbor's new puppy, about an ache in her shoulder that she had been trying not to mention. The conversation was not a grand reunion. It was a simple act of attention. Glenn realized attention was what he had owed for years. Not money, not security, attention. Regret can arrive late as the understanding that providing is not the same as participating. A person can build a life and still miss it. In the weeks that followed, Glenn practiced leaving work on time. He practiced sitting at the table after dinner with Teresa and letting the evening remain quiet. He practiced treating ordinary time as valuable, not as something to rush through on the way to something else. The change did not erase the past. It did not pretend the past had not shaped them. It simply returned Glenn to the room before more years slipped away without his noticing. He understood that the late life version of regret often sounds quiet. It sounds like a door closing gently. It can still be met with a hand on the handle if the hand arrives in time. At a long table in a church basement used for community meetings, Elaine sat with a paper plate of cookies and a cup of tea. The room smelled of coffee and cleaning spray. Folding chairs scraped softly as people found seats. Elaine had come for a reunion of sorts, a gathering of women who once worked together at a manufacturing plant that closed years ago. Elaine was 72. She had not expected to come. A postcard arrived from a woman named Patrice, someone Elaine remembered as quick to laugh and quick to notice when others were tired. The postcard listed a date and a time, nothing more. Elaine almost set it aside. She almost told herself she was too busy. Then she looked at her calendar and saw the truth. She was not too busy. She was simply accustomed to staying home. After retirement, Elaine's days had narrowed without her noticing. She cooked, cleaned, watched television, ran errands. She stayed competent. She stayed safe. She did not reach out much. She told herself she was giving people space. The real reason was that reaching out made her feel exposed. It risked rejection. It risked realizing how long it had been. Elaine's husband, Curtis, had died years earlier, leaving behind a quiet household and a familiar routine. Curtis had been the social one. He remembered birthdays. He planned small cookouts. After he was gone, Elaine told herself she preferred solitude. Some days she did. Other days she simply did not know how to initiate contact without Curtis acting as the bridge. When her son, Jordan, called, he often asked if she was seeing friends. Elaine would say she was fine. The word fine covered many things. It covered pride. It covered fatigue. It covered the fear of admitting that her life had become smaller than she intended. At the reunion, Elaine recognized faces that had changed but were still familiar in the eyes. Patrice waved from across the table. Another woman, Kendra, sat beside her with a cane resting against the chair. A few women spoke about grandchildren, about aches, about the price of groceries. The conversations drifted in and out like slow music. Elaine listened and felt a particular kind of regret. Not the regret of losing the job. The job had been hard. The regret was that she had lost the people, not through conflict, but through neglect. During the years at the plant, they saw each other every day. They shared lunches. They shared complaints. They shared small kindnesses that mattered when the work was rough. When the plant closed, they promised to stay in touch. They did for a while. Then birthdays were missed. Phone numbers changed. The connection thinned. Not from anger, but from silence. Elaine had treated friendship like something that either existed or did not. She had not understood that friendship is a practice. It requires small acts of attention, the same way a garden requires water. Without it, even the strongest plants dry out. Patrice passed a stack of old photos around the table. Elaine saw herself in one picture, younger, leaning in close as if she trusted the world. She felt a wave of tenderness for that version of herself. She also felt a quiet grief. Not grief for the past itself, but for how easily the past had been allowed to become unreachable. Elaine glanced at Kendra's hands as Kendra lifted her cup. The hands shook slightly. Kendra smiled anyway. Elaine realized this was what time did. It changed the body. It changed the pace. It also made choices feel more final. When the gathering ended, Patrice handed out slips of paper with phone numbers written in pen. Elaine tucked the paper into her wallet with care, as if it were fragile. At home, Elaine placed the paper on the kitchen counter, where she would see it. She did not want it to disappear into a drawer. She wrote each number into her phone slowly, checking the spelling twice. Then she sent a simple message to Patrice and Kendra to say she had enjoyed seeing them. The act was small. It did not fix years of distance. It did something quieter. It interrupted the pattern of letting time take things by default. Regret can arrive late as the realization that loneliness is sometimes chosen, not intentionally, but through inertia. The days fill themselves, and the empty spaces become normal. Elaine looked out the window at the darkening street and felt a strange comfort. It was not a dramatic comfort. It was the comfort of knowing that connection could still be practiced. It could still be returned to, slowly, with no performance required. In a bright hallway of a community center, Kenji stood outside a door marked with a simple sign that read "Stretching Class." The letters were printed in black on white paper, taped slightly crooked. Kenji adjusted the strap of his gym bag and felt an awkwardness he had not felt since childhood. He was 75 and new to the idea of joining a class. Kenji had been raised by a father who believed rest was laziness. His father worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7, and treated pain as something to outlast. Kenji absorbed that attitude without questioning it. When he was younger, it seemed to work. He could go a full day on little sleep. He could lift heavy things and feel fine the next morning. The early resilience made it easy to believe that care was optional. His daughter, Aiko, tried to talk to him about it in recent years. She worked as a physical therapist and spoke carefully, not as an expert, but as a daughter who wanted him to keep walking without fear. Kenji would nod and change the subject. He did not want to be treated like an aging man who needed instructions. For most of his life, Kenji had believed that his body would quietly cooperate. He had walked a lot for work, lifted boxes, climbed stairs, carried groceries. He did not think of himself as sedentary. He simply did not give his body deliberate attention. In his 60s, small discomforts began. Tightness in his hips, stiffness in his shoulders, a feeling of fatigue that lingered after sleep. Kenji treated these things as annoyances. He kept moving, but he did not adjust. He told himself he would deal with it later, when life slowed down. Life did not slow down. It changed. His wife, Yumi, kept asking him to take it easier. Kenji would smile and wave her off, not wanting to admit that he was worried. Yumi was practical and quiet. She did not argue. She simply watched. One morning, Kenji bent to tie his shoes and felt a sharp pull in his lower back. It was not an emergency. It did not send him to a hospital. It did something more disruptive. It made him careful. It made him aware of how quickly ordinary movement could become complicated. Kenji sat at the kitchen table afterward with a heating pad and stared at the calendar. He realized how many years he had treated his body like a tool, something to use until it failed. He had not treated it like a companion that needed steady attention. The regret was not about age. Age arrives regardless. The regret was about neglecting small maintenance because it did not feel urgent. He had spent decades taking pride in endurance, then discovered endurance has a cost when it is not balanced by care. Yumi suggested the community center. She did not frame it as a solution. She framed it as a place to be around others and move gently. Kenji agreed, partly because he trusted her, and partly because he was tired of the quiet fear that came from feeling fragile. Inside the room, the instructor, Carla, moved slowly and spoke in a calm, even rhythm. Kenji took a mat near the back. Around him were people his age and older. Some used chairs. Some moved with stiffness. No one looked embarrassed. No one looked like they were proving anything. Kenji followed the movements as best he could. He noticed how difficult it was to slow down. He noticed how his mind kept wanting to rush, to do more, to perform. He let the impulse pass. When the class ended, Kenji felt a gentle tiredness, the kind that came with attention rather than strain. He walked to the parking lot and realized he felt grateful, not because he had reversed time, because he had stopped pretending time could be ignored. Regret can arrive late as a recognition that the body keeps records. It records years of small decisions, Years of convenience. Years of postponement. The record becomes visible when movement becomes harder. Kenji returned the following week, then the week after. He began to treat his body as something worth steady respect, not because he feared death, but because he wanted the remaining years to feel livable and calm. At home, Yumi noticed the change in his pace. Kenji moved more carefully. He also smiled more, as if letting go of the need to prove strength had made the day easier. The regret did not vanish. It softened into something useful. A reminder that late-life wisdom often begins as a simple adjustment, made quietly, repeated until it becomes normal. That evening, he called Aiko and told her about the class. He did not ask for a plan. He simply let her know he had begun. The call was brief. The meaning of it stayed. On a rainy afternoon, Denise sat in her car outside a small bakery and watched people hurry through the parking lot with their collars turned up. She had driven there out of habit. She and her cousin, Joanne, used to meet for coffee at this place once a month. Joanne had moved away, and Denise had not replaced the ritual with anything else. She still found herself coming to the same lot, sitting for a few minutes, then leaving. Denise was 76. She was neat, organized, and careful with words. People described her as composed. The composure had helped her manage work, marriage, children, and the thousands small conflicts that fill a life. Over time, the same composure turned into a refusal to soften. Denise had not spoken to her younger sister, Carolyn, in 12 years. The break began with a disagreement about their mother's care, when their mother could no longer live alone. Denise believed one plan was practical. Carolyn believed another plan was kinder. Both believed they were protecting their mother. The disagreement hardened into accusation, then silence. As children, Denise was the older sister who handled things. She carried heavier grocery bags and answered adults with certainty. Carolyn grew up with a different kind of strength. She could ease a tense room. She could ask for help without embarrassment. Denise admired that, and later resented it, because it made her own rigidity feel obvious. When Denise's husband, Mark, was alive, he occasionally suggested she call Carolyn. Denise would nod and do nothing. After Mark died, the house became quieter, and the silence between the sisters blended into everything else. Denise told herself she was right. She told herself she had done what needed to be done. The story helped her feel steady, and it allowed her to avoid the discomfort of returning to the past. As the years passed, anger thinned into something flatter. Holidays became orderly and separate. Family news arrived through indirect channels and carried no warmth, only facts. Denise learned to treat the gap as normal, the way a person learns to live beside an unopened door. In the car outside the bakery, she watched a young mother hurry across the lot with a sleepy child pressed against her shoulder. The sight brought back a small memory of Carolyn in the back seat of their father's car, her cheek against the window, a strand of hair stuck to her forehead. Denise remembered reaching back to pull a blanket higher. The memory was ordinary, and it made the distance feel needless. Regret arrived as recognition rather than guilt. Denise was not being punished by the past. She was simply seeing the cost of pride. She had protected her certainty and lost the quiet companionship that had once made family feel like shelter. She drove home and searched through an old address book kept in a kitchen drawer. Carolyn's name was there, in Denise's careful hand, with an older number crossed out and a newer one penciled beside it. Denise sat at the table with the book open and let hesitation rise and fall like the rain on the window. When she called, the first minutes were stiff and cautious. Denise kept her voice even. She did not argue the old facts. She did not reopen the dispute to prove a point. She stayed with simpler truths, that the distance had lasted too long, and that she wanted a way forward that did not require either of them to win. The call did not repair 12 years in one evening. It did something quieter. It confirmed that the door was not locked forever. They spoke briefly about their lives now, about routines and small details that made the conversation feel human again. When the call ended, Denise sat with both relief and grief. Relief that contact was possible. Grief for the years that could not be returned. In the weeks that followed, Denise practiced returning without performance. She sent a short card in the mail with a few plain lines. She began to understand that reconciliation is often built the way trust is built, through small, repeated contact, not through one perfect conversation. The next afternoon, Denise drove back to the bakery and went inside instead of lingering in the lot. She ordered coffee, sat near the window, and let the room be ordinary. The regret did not disappear. It softened into something useful, a reminder that being right is rarely worth more than being close, and that the chance to return is not guaranteed to wait. The rain eased as she sat there. People came and went with pastries in paper bags. Denise stayed a little longer than usual, as if practicing the simple act of not leaving too soon. In the corner of a spare bedroom that had become a storage space, Omar found a guitar case covered in dust. The case was heavier than he expected when he lifted it. A faint smell of old wood rose as he set it on the bed and unlatched the metal clasps. Omar was 73. He had been cleaning the room because his wife, Sandra, wanted to turn it into a guest room for their grandchildren. The grandchildren were old enough now to sleep over without needing constant supervision, and Sandra liked the idea of the house feeling busy again. Inside the case, the guitar looked smaller than Omar remembered. The strings were dull. The body had a scratch near the edge. Omar ran his fingers along the neck and felt a tenderness that surprised him. He had bought the guitar in his 20s, before the children, before the mortgage, before the rhythm of ordinary responsibility took over. He played in the evenings after work. He learned songs slowly, repeating a few chords until his fingers stopped hurting. He never thought of himself as talented. He thought of himself as someone who liked the sound. When their first child, Leah, was born, Omar told himself he would pause for a while. When the second child, Marcus, arrived, he told himself he would return when things were less hectic. Then the years filled with school schedules, repairs, overtime shifts, and the slow accumulation of habits. The guitar case moved from one closet to another and became part of the house's background. Omar told himself that his practical life mattered more. He told himself that hobbies were indulgences. He told himself he did not have the energy. He did not realize that the energy he missed was not physical. It was the energy of having something that belonged to him alone, something that was not measured by usefulness. Omar worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large apartment complex. The job rewarded quick fixes: a leaking pipe, a duct door, a broken heater. Each problem had a solution and a timeline. Omar liked that clarity. Music did not offer the same kind of closure. A song could always be played better. Practice could always continue. In the busiest years, Omar chose work problems because they ended. Music asked for patience, and patience felt like a luxury. Once, A co-worker named Vince invited him to play on weekends with a group that met in a garage. Omar said yes, then cancelled, then stopped returning calls. Years later, he saw Vince at a grocery store and realized he could not remember the last time he had been invited into something simply for the pleasure of it. Sandra had never discouraged him. She simply adapted to the version of Omar that kept moving from task to task. She learned not to suggest. Omar rarely noticed what was missing because he stayed busy. Standing in the spare room with the guitar in his hands, Omar felt regret arrive in a way that was almost gentle. He did not regret providing for his family. He did not regret being reliable. He regretted how completely he had abandoned the part of himself that made time feel spacious. He carried the guitar to the living room and sat in the chair by the window. The afternoon light warmed his knuckles. He plucked one string. The sound was flat. He tightened a tuning peg and tried again. The note wavered, then steadied. Omar's fingers were slower now. His joints felt stiff. The chord shapes did not come back easily. He played a simple progression he remembered, and the sound filled the room in a quiet, imperfect way. Sandra walked in and stopped when she heard it. She did not praise him. She did not make a performance out of it. She simply sat on the couch with her coffee and listened for a minute. Omar felt his throat tighten. The moment felt private and strangely important. Later that evening, their daughter Leah called. Omar mentioned the guitar casually, as if it were not a confession. Leah laughed softly and said she remembered falling asleep to the sound when she was small. Omar had forgotten that. He had assumed the guitar had mattered only to him. Regret can arrive late as the realization that small joys are not optional extras. They are part of what makes a life feel like a life. Without them, time becomes a list. Omiya ordered new strings online. He placed the guitar on a stand in the living room instead of returning it to the case. The sight of it felt like an invitation, quiet and steady. He did not tell himself he would become good. He did not set a goal. He simply decided to begin again in the same ordinary room, while ordinary time was still available. In a desk drawer beside a stack of insurance papers, Lydia found a thin envelope marked with airline logos from a decade earlier. Inside were 2 boarding passes that had never been used. The paper was creased, the dates faded. Lydia held them for a moment and felt as if she were holding a small, quiet version of her past. Lydia was 78. She had been sorting paperwork after her husband, Frank, suggested they simplify the house. Frank had begun talking about moving to a smaller place. Lydia agreed, though the idea unsettled her. The house held evidence of who they had been, and letting go felt like admitting time. The unused boarding passes were for a trip to Vancouver. Frank had planned it for their 50th anniversary. He had found a small hotel near the water and a restaurant he thought Lydia would like. Lydia remembered how careful he had been, how he had placed the itinerary on the kitchen counter as if presenting a gift. Lydia also remembered what she said. She said the flight sounded tiring. She said the timing was not ideal. She said they could do it another year, when she felt more up to it. Frank nodded and put the papers away. He did not argue. He had learned that Lydia's reluctance was rarely about the trip itself. It was about discomfort. Lydia did not like being uncertain in new places. She liked her routines. She liked her bed. She liked knowing where the groceries were in the store. In their earlier years, Frank traveled for work and brought home small souvenirs. Lydia accepted them politely. She told herself she was practical. She told herself that staying home was mature. She did not admit that much of her caution was fear. Lydia's older sister, Pauline, had been the opposite. Pauline took buses to new cities alone. She joined tour groups. She wrote postcards in bright ink. When Lydia was younger, she admired Pauline and also dismissed her as restless. Pauline would tell Lydia about the way a new place changed the mind, how walking unfamiliar streets made time feel slower. Lydia would smile and change the subject. She did not want to admit she felt envy. When Pauline visited, she sometimes urged Lydia to go with her on small excursions, even locally. Lydia almost always declined. She wanted to keep the house ready. She wanted to be available. She wanted to avoid the slight embarrassment of not knowing what to do in a new setting. The reluctance looked like practicality from the outside. From the inside, it was a quiet shrinking. As Lydia held the unused boarding passes, she tried to remember what exactly she had feared. A long flight, a strange bed, not knowing how to get around. The fears seemed small now. They seemed almost childish. Lydia did not judge her younger self. She simply saw her clearly. Frank walked into the room and asked what Lydia had found. Lydia held up the boarding passes. Frank's face softened, and Lydia saw a brief sadness pass through his eyes. They sat at the kitchen table with the paper between them. Neither spoke for a while. The silence was not punishment. It was recognition. Lydia realized her regrets were not about dramatic mistakes. They were about the accumulated habit of saying no. No to weather that might be inconvenient. No to long drives. No to unfamiliar restaurants. No to invitations that required energy. The refusals felt harmless one by one. Together they formed a life that stayed inside a narrow boundary. Frank reached across the table and touched Lydia's hand. The gesture was gentle, not demanding. Lydia felt tears rise, not in grief, but in the quiet understanding that time had not been waiting for her comfort. That evening, Lydia opened a notebook and wrote down places she still wanted to see. She did not write faraway fantasies. She wrote practical places. The shoreline town 2 hours away, the museum she had postponed, the botanical garden her friend Ellen mentioned each spring. Lydia did not know if she would do all of it. The point was not completing a list. The point was noticing the pattern that had shaped her days. Regret can arrive late, as the understanding that caution has a cost. Comfort can become a cage if it is protected too carefully. In the following weeks, Lydia practiced choosing mild inconvenience on purpose. She agreed to a day trip with Frank. She ate lunch in a place she had never visited. She let herself feel uncertain without turning back. The change was not dramatic. It was a quiet widening of the boundary, done slowly, with Frank beside her, while ordinary time still remained. In a narrow kitchen with a small window above the sink, Andre watched his grandson, Micah, build a tower of cereal boxes on the floor. The boy was 5 and serious about his work. Andre sat at the table with his hands folded and felt an unfamiliar softness in his chest. Andre was 79. He had been raised in a family where affection was practical, not spoken. People worked. People provided. People showed love by doing what needed to be done. Andre learned to keep emotions contained, like tools put away after use. Andre's father, Ruben, had worked in a factory and came home exhausted. Ruben rarely smiled. He did not hit. He did not shout. He simply lived behind a wall of fatigue. When Andre did something well, Ruben would nod once and return to his newspaper. Andre learned to treat approval as a quiet absence of criticism. As a young man, Andre promised himself he would be different. He would be dependable. He would not disappear into drink or gambling. He kept those promises. He became the kind of man others relied on. Over the years, the reliability became a substitute for closeness. It was easier to do tasks than to reveal feeling, because tasks had clear outcomes. He carried that style into adulthood. He married a woman named Lucille, kind and steady. Lucille liked to talk. Andre listened, but he rarely offered words that revealed his inner life. He assumed Lucille knew he cared. He assumed his presence was proof. Their children grew up in a house where the bills were paid and the lawn was trimmed. Andre attended school events. He fixed what broke. He drove people places. When his daughter, Tessa, cried as a teenager, Andre would bring her a glass of water and sit nearby in silence. He did not know what to say. He believed silence was respect. Later, Tessa moved away. Andre's son, Malik, moved away too. The distance was not hostile. It was ordinary adulthood. Phone calls happened, but they were brief. Andre and his children spoke about schedules, repairs, weather. They did not speak about fear, gratitude, or tenderness. Lucille sometimes asked Andre why he never told the children he was proud of them. Andre would shrug. He would say he thought it was obvious. He did not understand that what feels obvious inside one person can remain invisible to another. In the kitchen, Micah knocked over the cereal tower and laughed. Andre watched and remembered Malik at that age, energetic and stubborn. Andre remembered Tessa's careful drawings taped to the refrigerator. He realized he could recall many details. What he could not recall were moments of direct warmth. Andre had not been cruel. He had been restrained. The restraint had a cost he had not wanted to see. That day, Malik arrived to pick Micah up. Malik stood in the doorway with his coat half on, juggling keys and a backpack. Andre saw the fatigue in his son's face, the weight of work and parenting. Andre felt a sudden urgency, not dramatic, just clear. He placed a hand on Malik's shoulder, an awkward gesture for him. Malik looked surprised. Andre told him he was glad he came by. He told him he appreciated how Micah was being raised. The words sounded plain. They were difficult for Andre to say. Malik's expression shifted. His face softened in a way Andre had not seen in years. He nodded once and looked down, as if to steady himself. After Malik and Micah left, Andre stood at the sink and washed dishes slowly. He felt regret, but it was not despair. It was recognition. He understood that love kept inside does not always land. It can remain trapped in the person who feels it. Regret can arrive late as the understanding that restraint is not the same as dignity. A person can be composed and still be unreachable. Andre began to practice speaking one simple sentence a day. He did not write long letters. He did not revisit the entire past. He called Tessa and told her he liked the photos she sent. He told Malik he was proud of the way he handled a hard week. He told Lucille he was grateful for the life they had built. The change did not make Andre sentimental. It made him present. In the quiet kitchen, The window showed a grey afternoon. The day continued. Andre felt the ordinary time of it, and he understood that ordinary time was exactly where the repairs had to happen. When Lucille came into the kitchen later, she noticed the change in Andre's face. She did not ask questions. She simply touched his arm as she passed, a small acknowledgement. Andre felt that touch land as if it were new. In a quiet waiting room with muted lighting and a stack of old magazines, Clara sat with her coat still on, hands folded in her lap. She had arrived early for an appointment she did not want to admit she needed. The room was warm, but her shoulders stayed tense, as if warmth were something to distrust. Clara was 70. For most of her life, she was known as dependable. She kept commitments, returned calls, and handled problems before they became visible. Friends described her as steady. Her children described her as strong. Clara accepted those descriptions, and over time she felt trapped by them. Strength, in her mind, meant not needing help. When her husband Russell died, Clara stayed composed. She organized the papers, made the calls, wrote notes of thanks, and returned to routine. People praised her for handling it well. Clara did not correct them. She did not explain that composure was not peace. It was control. Control was the only language she had for fear. Over the next years, Clara developed a habit of minimizing. A tight chest became indigestion. A sleepless week became a phase. A persistent loneliness became the price of maturity. She told herself that wanting comfort was childish. She told herself she should be grateful. Gratitude became another way to silence herself. The appointment was with a counselor at a community clinic. Clara had been encouraged to go by her neighbor Marianne. After Marianne noticed Clara withdrawing from ordinary life, Clara declined twice, then agreed the third time, not from hope, but from fatigue. She was tired of acting well. While she waited, Clara watched a man her age stand and pace near the window. His hands shook as he held his phone. He kept checking the screen, then looking up at nothing. Clara recognized the look. It was the look of someone trying to remain functional while carrying something that did not fit into a simple sentence. Clara realized how many people move through later life with private burdens, believing they should manage alone. The belief sounded dignified. In practice, it created isolation. It taught people to hide in plain sight. When Clara's name was called, she followed a hallway to a small office with a plain desk and a plant near the corner. The counselor, Helen, spoke gently and kept her tone even. Clara answered questions with the same careful restraint she used everywhere. She provided dates, responsibilities, and tasks. She described events, not impact. Helen did not push. She listened and waited, leaving space that felt uncomfortable at first. Clara began to hear her own silence. It had shape. It had weight. After several minutes, Clara admitted what she had avoided for years. Her days felt smaller than she expected. Some mornings she moved through the house without speaking aloud. Russell was missing in a way that never fully became lighter. The loss was not dramatic anymore. It was steady, like weather. The words sounded plain. The relief was immediate. Clara felt as if she had set down a bag she had been carrying without noticing its weight. She also felt embarrassed, not for grieving, but for how long she had pretended grief should have an expiration date. Clara did not leave the office transformed. She left with a plan that required no performance. She would attend a weekly group for widowed adults at the community center. She would take a short walk each morning, not for exercise, but for steadiness. She would call her daughter, Elise, twice a week instead of waiting for holidays. She would accept Marianne's offer to have tea on Sundays. Later in life, regret often comes from refusing the help that was available. The regret is not that help was needed. The regret is the years spent pretending it was not, and the friendships quietly starved by distance. On the drive home, Clara noticed the streetlights turning on earlier than in summer. The world was shifting without asking permission. Clara let that reality settle. She could not undo the years of silence, but she could stop adding new ones. That decision felt modest and real, and it gave the day a quiet brightness that did not need to be announced. That afternoon, Clara stopped at a small park and sat on a bench. The air was cold and clear. A few sparrows hopped near her feet, quick and ordinary. Clara did not feel cheerful. She felt calmer. Calm felt like progress. She understood that strength could include being seen quietly, without apology, and that the remaining years could still hold connection without requiring a dramatic personality change. At a long, folding table in a community workshop, Victor sorted small pieces of wood into neat piles, as if order itself could protect the afternoon. The room was filled with quiet activity. People sanded boards, repaired chairs, and mended small household objects. The pace was slow, careful, and ordinary. Victor was 68 and recently retired from a job where mistakes were expensive. For decades, he managed projects with tight deadlines, a world built on urgency. In that world, Victor learned to speak in instructions and corrections. It made him effective. It also made him hard to be close to. When retirement arrived, he expected relief. What he felt instead was emptiness, as if urgency had been holding him together. His wife, Delia, suggested the workshop after noticing Victor drifting around the house in restless loops. Victor disliked groups. He disliked the feeling of being unneeded. Still, he signed up, telling himself it was practical. Practical reasons felt safer than admitting he wanted company. At the workshop, Victor met a man named Sol, older than him and slower in movement, but steady. Sol worked on a broken stool with patient hands. He did not rush. He did not narrate. He simply stayed with the problem until the pieces fit. When the stool finally stood without wobbling, Sol set it down with quiet satisfaction, as if the reward was in steadiness itself. Victor watched Sol and felt an unexpected envy. Not envy for skill, but envy for ease. Victor spent his life trying to control outcomes. Sol seemed to accept that some things took time, and that time was not an enemy. During a break, Victor noticed that people spoke to each other with relaxed attention he rarely practiced. They shared small stories about families, gardens, and ordinary frustrations. No one tried to win the conversation. Victor realized that much of his adulthood had been spent in rooms where every exchange had a point, where listening was mostly preparation to respond. The regret landed quietly. Victor remembered how often he corrected Delia without meaning to, how he treated her suggestions as problems to refine. Delia endured it with patience, but over time she began speaking less. Victor took her silence as peace. He did not notice it was resignation. He also remembered his daughter, Paige, as a teenager, looking at him across the table with a controlled expression, as if any strong emotion would be dismissed as irrational. In retirement, Victor finally had time, but time alone did not create closeness. Closeness required a different habit, one Victor neglected, listening without adjusting. It required accepting that another person's way could be whole, even when it was different from his. That evening, back at home, Delia cooked dinner while Victor stood beside the counter. Instead of offering improvements, he asked about her day and stayed with the answer. He let the details remain imperfect. He noticed how difficult it felt to not manage the conversation. He also noticed how quickly Delia's posture softened when she realized Victor was not preparing a correction. The workshop continued each week. Victor fixed small objects and also practiced a quieter skill. He practiced being a person in a room without needing to dominate it. He practiced letting someone else's way be enough. One afternoon, Sol handed Victor a clamp without comment, an easy gesture of trust. Victor accepted it and felt what it was like to belong without earning the right through performance. A month later, Victor invited Paige to dinner. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions and let the answers stand as they were. The evening remained ordinary, and that ordinariness was the success. Victor understood that late-life repair is often built through a new pattern, not through dramatic apologies. Later in life, regret can come from misunderstanding what competence does. Competence can build a stable life. It can also build walls. The walls are made of small habits that seem harmless until years pass. Victor began treating the remaining years as a chance to learn a softer posture toward others. Less tightening, more allowing. The change was steady, like sanding a rough edge until it no longer caught the hand. Victor did not become sentimental. He became quieter. He noticed that calm attention could do more than critique ever did. The relief in that steadiness felt like a quiet kind of joy, and it gave him something better than urgency to hold him together when the days were wide and unstructured. In the late morning, Irene stood at the kitchen counter with a stack of unopened mail and a pair of reading glasses balanced low on her nose. The house was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. Irene moved slowly, not from frailty, but from caution. She had learned that certain envelopes could change the mood of an entire day. Irene was 77. She had always been organized, the kind of person who kept receipts in labeled folders and wrote appointments in a paper calendar even after everyone else moved to phones. She liked clarity. She liked knowing where things stood. That preference served her well in work and in parenting. It served her poorly in conflict. For 15 years, Irene had not spoken to her oldest friend, Beth. They met as teenagers and stayed close through marriages, babies, and job changes. They knew each other's stories with a familiarity that felt like home. Then a disagreement arrived, small at first. It was about a shared decision involving a volunteer committee. Irene felt betrayed. Beth felt misunderstood. Both became proud in a way that felt justified. The friendship did not end with an argument that exploded. It ended with distance that hardened. Irene told herself she was protecting her dignity. She told herself that Beth should know what she did wrong. The story allowed Irene to stay still. Over time, Irene found that being right did not feel as good as she expected. It felt lonely. She avoided places where she might run into Beth. She stopped attending certain community events. She pretended it was about being busy, but it was about avoiding the awkwardness of unresolved history. She lost not only a friend, but a part of her own life that existed in shared memory. That morning among the mail was a small card with Beth's name in the return corner. Irene recognized the handwriting immediately. Her stomach tightened. She considered placing the card in a drawer and returning to routine. That was the old method. Delay, silence, control. Instead, Irene opened it. The card was a simple holiday note. It contained no argument, no defense, no reopening of facts. It mentioned a shared memory from years ago, a summer afternoon when they sat on a porch swing with iced tea and watched a storm roll in. Irene felt tears rise, not from sadness alone, but from recognition. The memory was warm and ordinary, and it made the long silence feel like a waste. Irene sat at the table and let regret come in full. Not regret for the committee disagreement. Regret for the years that followed, years shaped by one stubborn stance. She could not remember all the details of the original conflict anymore. She could remember the absence that replaced the friendship. The absence was clearer than the facts. Later in life, regret often comes from the way pride scales. A small injury becomes a story about identity. A person stops returning because returning would require humility. Irene went to a drawer where she kept stationery she rarely used and chose a plain card. She wrote slowly, choosing words that did not perform. She did not rehearse blame. She did not demand an explanation. She wrote that she missed Beth. She wrote that the silence felt too long. She wrote that she was open to speaking again, even briefly, even imperfectly. After she sealed the envelope, Irene stood by the window and watched the light shift on the street. She felt nervous, but also lighter. She had taken a step that did not guarantee anything, but it ended the habit of doing nothing. A few days later, a new envelope arrived. Irene recognized the handwriting again. She opened it slowly. Beth's response was careful. It did not argue the past. It acknowledged the distance and the years before it. It suggested meeting for coffee at a place they both knew. Irina went on a quiet weekday morning and chose a table near the window. When Beth entered, she looked older and also familiar in the eyes. The meeting was not a resetting of youth. It was two women practicing humility. They spoke in small pieces. They did not solve every detail. They began where they could. Afterward, Irene noticed a steady calm in her body. Repair could be imperfect and still be real. The years of silence could not be reclaimed, but the years ahead did not have to repeat the same pattern. That was the positive part of regret. It clarified what was worth the discomfort of returning. Irene drove home with the sense that time could still be used well, even after being used poorly. In a spare room lined with shelves, Sonia stood with a cardboard box open on the floor and a stack of decorative items in her hands. The room held the overflow of a long life. Extra dishes, unused gifts, framed prints still wrapped in plastic, piles of magazines that promised information but mostly delivered noise. Sonia was 74. She and her partner Glenn were preparing to downsize to a smaller apartment. The decision was practical. The house was too much to maintain. The stairs were getting harder. The yard work took longer each season, so Sonia expected the move to feel like a simple project. Instead, each object felt like a memory with weight. Sonia had been a collector for decades. She collected cookware, holiday decorations, specialized tools for hobbies she never fully pursued, books she intended to read later. Each purchase carried a quiet optimism. The item would improve life. It would make her more prepared. It would make the home feel complete. Over time, the collecting became a way to manage anxiety. Buying something felt like progress, even when the real need was rest. In her 40s and 50s, Sonia worked hard and felt constantly behind. When she was tired, she bought small comforts. When she was uncertain, she bought supplies. When she felt unappreciated, she bought gifts for others and felt briefly useful. None of it was malicious. It was a pattern. The pattern filled rooms. Now, in the spare room, Sonia picked up a bread machine still in its box and realized she had never used it. She remembered the day she bought it, imagining warm loaves and slow mornings. The mornings never arrived. The machine became a symbol of a life that was always waiting to start later. The regret was not about money alone. It was about attention. Sonia had spent years directing attention toward objects instead of experiences, toward preparation instead of living. She had postponed simple pleasures, telling herself there would be time when the house was organized, when work was lighter, when the schedule was calmer. The schedule was rarely calmer. The house was rarely organized. Time passed anyway. Glenn worked in the next room, quietly sorting tools. He moved slowly and did not judge. Sonia appreciated that restraint. It allowed her to see the situation without defensiveness. She could finally admit that some of her choices were attempts to fill a space that could not be filled with things. Sonia began placing items into 3 piles: keep, donate, discard. The work was tedious and also clarifying. She noticed that the items she truly wanted to keep were not the ones that looked impressive. They were the ones connected to real moments. A chipped mug from an old road trip, a small carving given by a friend, a photo album with handwritten notes. As the afternoon progressed, Sonia felt lighter. The lightness did not come from minimalism as a concept. It came from releasing the belief that completeness could be purchased. She began to see the smaller apartment not as a loss, but as a relief. Less to manage, less to clean, less to maintain. More room for quiet. Later in life, regret often comes from mistaking accumulation for security. Possessions can provide comfort, but they also demand time. The demand is subtle until it becomes heavy. That evening, Sonia made tea and sat with Glenn at the kitchen table. The house was still full, but the direction had changed. Sonia felt grateful that she could still choose what to carry forward. The lesson was simple. Life becomes calmer when the focus shifts from having to being. The shift did not require perfection. It required a willingness to let go, one box at a time. In the following days, Sonia found that letting go did not erase the past. It made the past easier to hold. She gave certain items to people who would actually use them. A neighbor named Talia took the bread machine with real enthusiasm. A young couple accepted extra dishes for their first apartment. Sonia watched their gratitude and felt satisfaction. The objects became useful at last, but in someone else's life. Sonia also noticed a change in her own mind. When restlessness arrived, she no longer reached automatically for shopping sites. She walked around the block. She wrote down a memory from the day. She called her sister, May, and stayed on the phone longer than usual. The actions were small, but aligned with what she wanted. More presence, less management. The smaller apartment began to feel like a doorway. The vision was not glamorous. It was peaceful. Regret did not demand self-punishment. It offered clarity. The remaining years could still be shaped by simpler priorities, and that realization made the work of sorting feel like an act of care rather than loss. In a small den filled with photo albums and old tools hung neatly on a pegboard, Marcus sat across from his father, Edwin, while the television played with the sound turned down. The afternoon was quiet. A winter sun rested on the carpet in a pale rectangle. Marcus had come to help with a few repairs, the kind of visit that gave him a clear reason to be there. Marcus was 69. Edwin was 91 and still lived in his own home. Stubbornly independent. Edwin moved more slowly now, but his habits remained precise. He kept the kitchen clean, the bills paid, and the driveway clear. He accepted help reluctantly, and Marcus had learned not to push. For most of his adulthood, Marcus kept the relationship with his father practical. Edwin was not a man who spoke easily about feelings. Marcus learned that tasks were the safest way to connect. Fixing a hinge, changing a filter, trimming branches. The work created a shared focus that prevented awkwardness. In Marcus's 50s, when career and parenting were busiest, he visited less. He told himself Edwin was fine. Edwin rarely complained. Edwin did not ask. Silence looked like stability. Marcus did not notice that silence can also be a way of hiding need. A month earlier, Marcus attended a reunion lunch and ran into a former co-worker named Hal, a man who once seemed unbreakable. Hal mentioned caring for a parent and described the slow shift from independence to vulnerability. Hal spoke calmly, but Marcus heard something underneath. Regret for the years when time was assumed. The conversation stayed with Marcus longer than he expected. Sitting in Edwin's den, Marcus looked at his father's hands. The hands were thinner now, the knuckles enlarged by age. Marcus remembered those hands holding him steady when he learned to ride a bike, lifting him onto a stool to reach a high shelf, guiding a saw through wood with patient control. Marcus realized he had carried those memories for decades without ever returning them as words. The regret was simple. Marcus had spent years assuming gratitude was understood. He treated appreciation as private, something that did not need to be spoken. He had inherited the same emotional economy Edwin lived by, and he could see the cost of it now. Unspoken things do not always land. They remain trapped inside the person who feels them. Marcus asked Edwin to show him an old toolbox stored in the closet. Edwin retrieved it and opened it with careful hands. Inside were small objects Marcus recognized from childhood. A worn measuring tape, a pencil stub, a pocket knife with a chipped handle. Edwin touched each item as if it carried a story. Marcus found himself asking about those stories. He listened and stayed with the details. The hour passed without urgency. Marcus noticed Edwin's posture change, a subtle easing, as if the attention itself was support. Later, Marcus brought out a small recorder from his bag and set it on the table. He did not make it a project. He treated it as a way of keeping what mattered. Edwin talked about work, about money being tight, about learning to do things properly because waste could not be afforded. Marcus listened and felt grateful in a deeper way than nostalgia. He felt grateful for the steadiness that shaped his own life. Later in life, regret often comes from waiting to speak the simplest truths. Words feel unnecessary until time makes them scarce. When Marcus left that day, he returned again 2 days later, then the next week. The visits were not dramatic. They were steady, like maintenance, like care that finally became deliberate. Marcus could not add years. He could add presence. Presence felt like a quiet repair, and it made regret feel less like punishment and more like guidance. Marcus also began to notice his own habits in the days between visits. He had been living on momentum, treating family as background and work as foreground. He started calling Edwin in the evenings to check in, not to solve anything, but to keep the line open. He wrote reminders in his calendar the way he once wrote meetings, and he felt relief that care could be deliberate. Edwin did not suddenly become expressive. The change was quieter. Edwin began leaving a chair pulled out at the table, as if expecting company. He asked Marcus to look at small things that could have waited. The requests were practical, but Marcus understood what they meant. They were permission. Marcus accepted that their relationship would always be shaped by tasks and restraint. He simply added one new element: consistent presence. The regret remained, but it became useful. It reminded Marcus that appreciation has to be expressed while there is still time for it to land. On a weekday evening, Leo stood in the back of a small rehearsal room at the Public Arts Center with a sheet of music in his hands. He did not know how to read it. He held it anyway, as if holding it was the first step toward belonging. Leo was 71. For most of his life, he described himself as not artistic. He worked in accounting and treated creativity as something other people were born with. Leo admired musicians and painters from a distance the way he admired athletes, as if the category was closed to him. He told himself that practical people did not spend time on things that had no clear purpose. In his 20s, Leo wanted to learn piano. He mentioned it once to a friend and then dismissed the idea. Lessons cost money. His schedule was busy. Later became a habit. Decades passed. Leo did not regret the life he built. He had a long marriage with his wife, Andrea. He raised 2 children who were stable and kind. He provided consistency. Still, a quiet emptiness stayed in the corners of his days. Leo filled the emptiness with errands and small obligations, then told himself he was satisfied. After retirement, the errands were not enough. The days stretched. Leo found himself watching television longer than he intended. The hours blurred. He could feel time moving, and the sensation made him anxious. Leo responded the way he always did. He tried to control it, to schedule it, to make it useful. Andrea suggested a community chorus at the arts center. Leo laughed at the idea at first, then became quiet. He realized his laughter was a defense. He feared being inexperienced in front of others. He feared looking foolish. That fear had shaped more of his life than he wanted to admit. At the first rehearsal, the director, Sienna, greeted newcomers without fuss. People chatted softly and arranged chairs. A man named Cal offered Leo an extra pencil. A woman named Patrice shifted over to make space. No one performed confidence. Everyone looked like a person simply showing up. Leo listened as warm-ups began. The sound was imperfect and human. Some voices wavered, some were strong. The group moved together anyway. Leo felt something loosen in his chest. The room did not demand talent. It demanded participation. As rehearsal continued, Leo noticed a familiar regret. He had spent decades protecting himself from embarrassment and called it practicality. The protection saved him from discomfort. It also saved him from growth. Late in life, that trade became clear. Leo did not become skilled in one night. He did not transform into a different personality. He learned something simpler. He learned that beginnerhood could be peaceful. It could be quiet recognition. A person could start late and still be part of something. After rehearsal, Leo drove home through dark streets and felt an unexpected lightness. He had done something that was not efficient. The lack of efficiency felt like freedom. He also felt grateful that the opportunity still existed and that it did not require a dramatic story. It required a weekly commitment and the willingness to be ordinary among others. Regret often points to the places where fear disguised itself as reason. Leo understood that the remaining years could still include newness. The realization was calming, not urgent. He could begin slowly. That was enough. In the next weeks, Leo practiced at home in small ways. He hummed while making coffee. He played recordings and followed along with the printed lines, not to master them, but to become familiar. The practice felt awkward and satisfying. It gave him direction that was not tied to productivity. Andrea noticed the change without making it sentimental. Leo was less tense. He moved more slowly through the house, as if he no longer needed to outrun empty time. When their daughter, Nina, visited with the grandchildren, Leo found himself more patient on the floor, building simple structures out of blocks. The chorus had not just given him music, it had given him a place where he could be a beginner again. The group remained ordinary. It met on the same night each week. Some weeks the sound was stronger, some weaker. The steadiness mattered more than the outcome. Leo understood that the value of a late life change is not in becoming impressive. It is in becoming more present. Regret, in this case, became a guide rather than a scolding. It pointed toward a life that contained more than maintenance. Leo did not need to fix the past. He needed to stop repeating it. The weekly rehearsal was enough to change the shape of his days. In the corner of a small hospital cafeteria, Mariah sat with a paper cup of coffee and watched people pass with tired faces. She was not there for an emergency. She was there for a routine visit with her sister Janelle, who needed a driver after a minor procedure. The setting still carried the familiar weight of worry, and Mariah felt her body tense as if preparing for bad news. Mariah was 73. For most of her life, she was the person others relied on. She remembered birthdays, filled in for co-workers, watched nieces and nephews, hosted gatherings, and handled the quiet tasks that kept families running. People praised her for being generous. Mariah accepted the praise and also felt trapped by it. The praise became an expectation, and the expectation became her identity. In earlier years, Mariah told herself that saying yes was simply who she was. She believed refusal was selfish. She believed conflict was dangerous. Her childhood taught her that peace depended on accommodating others. She became skilled at anticipating needs and meeting them before anyone asked. The skill made her useful. It also trained her to ignore her own limits. As she aged, the consequences became clearer. Mariah was often exhausted. She felt resentful in ways she tried to hide. She began to avoid phone calls, then felt guilty for avoidance. The cycle created a low, steady tension that colored even quiet days. Janelle noticed it first. Janelle was younger and more direct. Janelle did not soften the truth. Janelle suggested that Mariah's constant help was not always appreciated the way Mariah hoped. Some people accepted it as a given, then moved on. The comment stayed in Mariah's mind, not as an insult, but as a mirror. In the cafeteria, Mariah watched an older couple move slowly toward the exit. The woman held the man's elbow, and the man leaned slightly, trusting the support. The scene was simple. It reminded Mariah that support is meant to be mutual, not one-directional. Mariah had spent years offering support without allowing herself to lean. The regret arrived with quiet clarity. Mariah could list dozens of times she gave up rest to solve other people's problems. She could list the weekends she spent running errands for relatives who could have planned better. The regrets were not about single dramatic sacrifices. They were about the slow surrender of her own time, until her days felt like they belonged to everyone else. After Janelle's appointment, Mariah drove her home and helped her settle on the couch. Mariah noticed the impulse to do more, to clean the kitchen, to manage everything. She paused. She let the impulse pass. She did what was needed, and then prepared to leave. At home, Mariah opened her calendar and saw the pattern. Commitments stacked closely together, many of them chosen out of habit rather than desire. Mariah began crossing out a few that were optional. The act made her stomach tighten. The tightness was familiar. It was the feeling of disappointing someone. Mariah realized she had been letting that feeling direct her life. In the following weeks, Mariah practiced small refusals without drama. Mariah declined one invitation and offered an alternative date. Mariah stopped volunteering for the first task in every room. Mariah let other people solve problems that belonged to them. The changes were quiet. They did not require announcements. They required repetition. Later in life, regret often reveals where kindness became self-erasure. Mariah could see that she had confused being good with being endlessly available. Mariah began to feel gratitude for the clarity, because clarity meant the remaining years could be different. Her relationships did not collapse. Some people adjusted. A few pulled back. The outcomes taught Mariah something she had avoided knowing. The people who valued her most could adapt to boundaries. The boundaries did not make her colder. They made her more present when she did choose to give. Mariah sat one evening in her living room with a book and a lamp turned low. The house was still. The stillness felt unfamiliar at first, then soothing. Mariah understood that peace is not only the absence of conflict, it is also the presence of a life that includes the self. Mariah did not rewrite her personality. She remained helpful, warm, attentive. The difference was that help became a choice instead of a reflex. That choice returned time to her, and time returned energy. The regret softened into acceptance, and acceptance made room for a simple pleasure, doing less, and feeling no need to justify it. On a cool morning at the edge of a small community pool, Douglas sat on a bench and waited for the doors to open. A thin fog hovered in the air. The building smelled faintly of chlorine, clean and familiar. Douglas held a towel and a small bag with a change of clothes. The routine felt new, and he felt slightly self-conscious, as if he were entering a room where he did not belong. Douglas was 75. For most of his life, he treated his body as something that would keep working as long as it was not asked for too much. He did not abuse it. He simply ignored it. He worked hard, ate what was convenient, and postponed exercise until later. Later arrived as retirement, and retirement arrived with stiffness. Douglas noticed the stiffness first in small ways. He avoided getting down on the floor because standing back up felt complicated. He stopped taking long walks because his knees complained. He carried himself carefully, a person gradually negotiating with their own limitations. The caution made him feel older than he wanted to feel. His friend Omar mentioned the pool after noticing Douglas. Decline invitations that involved walking. Omar was the same age and had a practical calm about him. Omar did not speak in slogans. Omar spoke in routines. Omar said that the pool was easy on joints and that the early morning lane was quiet. Douglas agreed, partly because the idea sounded manageable and partly because he was tired of watching his world shrink. Sitting on the bench, Douglas watched other older adults arrive. Some moved with canes. Some moved quickly. Everyone looked ordinary. No one looked like a heroic athlete. Douglas felt his shame soften. The room did not require a certain kind of body. It required a willingness to move. Once inside, Douglas eased into the water and felt the immediate relief of buoyancy. The water held him in a way the ground did not. Douglas began slowly, not trying to prove anything. His strokes were clumsy at first. He rested often. Douglas noticed that the effort did not feel punishing. It felt stabilizing. The regret arrived while he floated on his back for a moment and watched the ceiling lights ripple on the surface. Douglas realized how often he treated health as something to think about later, as if later were guaranteed. Douglas realized that the regret was not dramatic. It was a series of small decisions that made his options narrower. He could not go back and give himself a different 40 years. He could still make his 75th year more livable. Over the next months, Douglas returned to the pool 3 mornings a week. He started walking again on afternoons when the weather was mild. He stretched gently before bed. The improvements were slow and modest. The value was not in becoming young. The value was in regaining ease, standing without thinking about it, climbing stairs with less planning, sleeping more comfortably. Douglas also noticed a mental shift. Moving his body made his mind calmer. He worried less. He felt less trapped by time. The routine gave the day a structure that was neither work nor avoidance. Later in life, regret often teaches that the body is not a separate project. It is the container for every ordinary pleasure. Neglect narrows the container. Care expands it. One morning, Douglas finished a short set of laps and sat again on the bench, towel around his shoulders. He felt tired in a clean way. He felt grateful that small repairs were still possible. The regret became a guide, pointing toward maintenance rather than punishment, toward gentle consistency rather than sudden change. Douglas left the building and stepped into the cool air with a steadier pace, accepting his age without surrendering to it. Douglas did not become obsessed with improvement. He avoided the old trap of turning care into pressure. He marked pool days on a calendar and treated them like appointments he would not cancel without reason. When he missed a day, he returned the next one without drama. In spring, Douglas visited his daughter, Lila, and her family. The grandchildren wanted to play outside. Douglas noticed that he could join them longer without needing to sit down immediately. He could walk to the end of the street and back with less planning. The change was modest, but it made him more available to the moment. The pool also became a quiet community. He recognized faces and exchanged small greetings. The routine created steadiness that retirement had taken away. Regret did not vanish. It softened into acceptance. Douglas understood that attention now was still meaningful, and the remaining years did not have to be defined by shrinking. In a small study with a desk lamp turned low, Evelyn sat with a blank sheet of paper and a pen that felt heavier than it should. The room was quiet. A stack of envelopes waited on one side of the desk, bills and flyers and ordinary demands. The blank page was different. It asked for a kind of honesty that could not be postponed with chores. Evelyn was 78. She had been a capable mother in the practical sense. Meals happened. Homework was checked. Clothes were clean. She worked hard and kept the household stable. She also had a temper that rose quickly when she felt overwhelmed. Evelyn did not see herself as cruel. Evelyn saw herself as stressed, strict, trying to keep things from falling apart. Years later, the distinction felt thin. Her son, Trent, was 49 now. They spoke rarely. The distance did not begin with one dramatic rupture. It grew from repeated small injuries, arguments that never fully repaired, comments delivered sharply, apologies offered too late, or in half measures. Trent moved away and built his own life. Evelyn told herself that adult children are busy. Evelyn told herself the relationship was fine. The truth was that it was cautious, limited, and held at arm's length. Evelyn had spent years hoping time would smooth it out. Time did not. Time simply passed, and the distance became familiar. The change came when Evelyn attended a small family gathering and noticed how Trent interacted with his own children. He was patient in ways Evelyn was not at his age. He spoke with calm. He corrected without humiliation. Evelyn watched and felt a mix of pride and grief. Pride that her son was a steadier parent. Grief that her own parenting had included more sharpness than she wanted to remember. Later that night, Evelyn lay awake and replayed ordinary scenes from decades earlier, rushing through dinner, snapping at Trent for small mistakes, treating his feelings as inconvenience. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. The damage was made of everyday moments, repeated until they formed a tone. Regret arrived as quiet recognition. Evelyn could not change her earlier years. Evelyn could change how she carried them now. Carrying them honestly meant acknowledging harm without defending it. In the study, Evelyn began writing a letter. She did not try to make it poetic. She kept it plain. She described what she remembered. She named her own patterns without blaming stress or circumstance. She expressed that she understood why Trent kept distance. She expressed that she did not want the remaining years to be limited to careful small talk. Evelyn felt fear as she wrote. Fear of rejection. Fear of being ignored. Fear that it was too late. She also felt relief. The letter allowed her to stop pretending that silence was acceptance. When the letter was finished, Evelyn read it once, then again. She removed any lines that sounded like excuses. She left in the parts that were uncomfortable because they were true. She signed her name and placed the page in an envelope. In the days that followed, Evelyn did not expect immediate repair. Evelyn expected uncertainty. Evelyn accepted that uncertainty as part of the cost of late honesty. She found comfort in the fact that she had finally met the situation directly. Later in life, regret often comes from waiting too long to speak plainly. The delayed truth becomes heavier with each year. Evelyn understood that even if the outcome was imperfect, the attempt mattered. It was a step toward peace, and peace was the real goal. A week later, Evelyn received a short message from Trent. It did not solve everything. It acknowledged the letter and suggested a time to talk. Evelyn felt her shoulders drop, as if her body had been holding tension for years. The path ahead was slow, but it existed. That existence felt hopeful, and it made the blank page on the desk feel like the beginning of something calmer. Evelyn prepared for that conversation by practicing a different posture. She listened more than she explained. She let Trent speak without correcting details. She noticed the urge to defend herself and allowed the urge to pass. The practice was difficult and steadying. Over the next months, they spoke more often. The conversations were sometimes awkward, sometimes surprisingly easy. Evelyn learned that repair is built through consistency, not intensity. She focused on smaller reliability, remembering what Trent mentioned, asking about his work, sending a card on an ordinary day. The regret remained as a quiet background, but it no longer ruled her. It reminded her to value connection over being right. Evelyn understood that late-life reconciliation is not a return to the past. It is the creation of something new that does not require pretending. That realism felt like peace. On a bright afternoon with winter light slanting through bare branches, Harold sat at a small table in a library reading room and watched dust move through a sunbeam. The room was silent except for the soft turning of pages. Harold had come to return a book, and then he stayed. Staying felt like a decision. Harold was 72. For decades he lived with a sense of haste that rarely matched reality. Even on calm days, he moved as if something urgent waited around the corner. He ate quickly. He finished conversations early. He kept lists and checked them twice. He was proud of his efficiency. Efficiency made him reliable. It also made him absent. In his working years, Harold believed the pace was necessary. There were bills, children, obligations. Later, when the obligations eased, the pace remained. It became his default. He discovered that retirement does not automatically create peace. It creates open time. And open time can feel unsettling to a person who has learned to equate stillness with laziness. Harold's wife, Corinne, used to tell him to slow down. He smiled at the idea and continued. Corinne adapted. She stopped asking. She planned her days independently, meeting friends, taking classes, building a life that did not rely on Harold's attention. Harold assumed this meant Corinne was fine. He did not notice that he was being gently left behind. One evening, Corinne mentioned a book club at the library and said she would be going regularly. Harold agreed without thinking. Then he realized something. He did not know what Corinne read. He did not know the names of her friends. He knew the logistics of her life, not the texture. That realization was not a crisis. It was a quiet grief. Harold began visiting the library with Corinne once in a while. At first, he treated it as an errand. He picked a book quickly and checked it out. Over time, he learned to linger. He sat in the reading room and watched people, not in a suspicious way, but in a calm way, as if he were relearning how to be in a place without extracting a result from it. The regret arrived as Harold noticed how many moments he had hurried through. Family dinners where he focused on cleanup rather than conversation. Vacations where he treated relaxation as another task to complete. Even quiet mornings when the light was beautiful and he did not see it because he was already thinking about the next item. Later in life, regret often comes from realizing that presence is not a personality trait. It is a practice. It can be missed for decades, then relearned in small ways. In the library, Harold opened a book and read slowly. When his mind drifted to lists, he returned to the page. He noticed the calm that followed. He noticed that calm did not waste time. It made time feel fuller. At home, Harold began eating more slowly. He sat with Corinne longer after dinner instead of disappearing into projects. He asked about the book club and listened to details he once would have treated as background. He began to understand that intimacy is built through attention, not through providing. The change did not require Harold to become a different man. It required him to notice what he already had. Corinne did not ask for grand gestures. She responded to steadiness. When Harold was present, the house felt warmer. Harold continued visiting the library, sometimes alone. He began to see it as a place where the world moved at a humane pace. The reading room became a kind of training ground for attention. The regret did not vanish. It softened into gratitude that he had time left to practice. On that bright afternoon, Harold finished a chapter and closed the book. He watched the sunbeam again. The dust drifted. The room remained quiet. Harold felt something he rarely felt in earlier years. Enough. Not as a conclusion, but as a calm acceptance that the moment did not need to be improved to be worth living. In the weeks that followed, Harold found that the practice spread. He went on short walks without headphones and noticed small things he once ignored: the sound of wind in branches, the quiet routines of neighbors, the way evening light settled on familiar streets. He began calling his son, Derek, not to exchange updates, but to stay connected. The calls were brief and ordinary. The ordinariness was the point. Harold understood that regret can be a doorway. It can lead to bitterness, or it can lead to a slower life that finally matches what matters. Harold chose the second path without drama. The choice did not erase the past. It made the present calmer. Calm, he discovered, was not the absence of activity. It was the presence of attention. In a quiet neighborhood where the houses sat close together and the sidewalks held familiar cracks, Rosa stood at her front window and watched a delivery truck pull away. A small package sat on her porch like an unanswered question. Rosa was 76. She lived alone now, not because she had always wanted to, but because life had unfolded in a way that left her with more quiet than she expected. Her husband, Matteo, had died 6 years earlier. Her daughter, Karina, lived 2 hours away. Her son, Luis, lived farther. Rosa's days were orderly and calm on the surface. Underneath, there was a steady loneliness she tried not to dramatize. Rosa opened the door, picked up the package, and carried it to the kitchen table. It was from Karina. Inside was a framed photograph of the grandchildren, smiling in bright sunlight. Rosa traced the edge of the frame with her finger and felt warmth and sadness arrive together. Rosa had always been the steady one in the family. She cooked, cleaned, remembered birthdays, kept traditions alive. She was warm in action, but guarded in words. When Matteo was alive, he was the one who named feelings. He said when he missed people. He said when he was proud. Rosa believed those things could be assumed. She believed love did not need to be spoken. After Matteo died, Rosa tried to keep the family connected through tasks. She mailed gifts. She sent cards. She offered help when someone needed childcare. But when the phone calls came, Rosa kept them brief. She asked about schedules and schools and weather. She did not ask deeper questions because deeper questions felt like opening a door to pain. She did not want to cry in front of her children. She did not want to burden them with her loneliness. Over time, the calls became less frequent. Rosa told herself the children were busy. She told herself that older people should not demand attention. The story sounded noble. It also made her invisible. One evening, her son Luis called unexpectedly. The call was short. It was mostly logistics. Rosa hung up and realized she could not remember the sound of Luis laughing. She could remember it from his childhood. She could not remember the last time she heard it in adulthood. The realization landed quietly, but it stayed. Rosa's regret was not that her children had moved away. That was normal. The regret was that she had let pride masquerade as selflessness. She had avoided asking for connection because she feared appearing needy. In doing so, she had taught her family to treat her as durable, as someone who would be fine without much contact. Later in life, regret often arrives when a person realizes they have been training others how to treat them. The next day, Rosa took the framed photograph and placed it on the kitchen counter where she would see it in the morning light. Then she wrote down a simple plan on a notepad. Call Karina on Wednesday afternoons. Call Luis on Sundays. Not to check in like an obligation, but to stay in touch as a living relationship. When Wednesday arrived, Rosa called Karina and asked about her day. Rosa listened and stayed. She asked about the grandchildren and also about Karina herself, about what felt hard and what felt good. Rosa noticed that as she listened, Karina's voice softened. The call lasted longer than usual. When Rosa hung up, she felt tired and also fuller, as if her day had regained color. Rosa began leaving short voice messages, small warm notes instead of long texts. She stopped trying to sound efficient. She practiced sounding human. The change did not require confessions. It required consistency. In the following weeks, Rosa also began inviting neighbors for tea. A woman named Denise from 2 doors down came one afternoon and sat at the table with Rosa. They talked about ordinary things, recipes, weather, old jobs. The conversation was not profound. It was companionship. And companionship was the medicine Rosa had avoided admitting she needed. Rosa's regret did not turn into bitterness. It turned into a quiet commitment. She would not spend the remaining years performing independence. She would let herself be connected, and she would accept that connection required reaching out even when it felt awkward. Rosa understood that being loved is not only about being good, it is also about allowing oneself to be known. That realization felt hopeful. It did not change the past. It made the future less lonely. In a small office where the blinds were half open and late afternoon light cut across the desk, Dr. Miller sat with a notepad and listened while Nikhil spoke slowly about the last year of his life. The tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, which made the weight of the subject feel heavier. Nikhil was 72. He came to the appointment because his primary doctor suggested it, not because he thought he needed it. On paper, his life looked stable. He had a long career, a modest home, a steady marriage to a woman named Asha. He had friends he saw occasionally. He had no major crisis. The problem was that he felt constantly tense, and he had begun to realize he could not outrun the tension by staying busy. Nikhil described himself as a person who avoided conflict. He prided himself on being reasonable. He kept peace in groups. He smoothed over disagreements. He agreed quickly, then resented quietly. The pattern had been with him since childhood, when he learned that calmness kept the household from becoming volatile. The cost showed up later. Nikhil rarely asked directly for what he wanted. He waited for others to notice. When they did not, he felt invisible. He told himself he should not need to ask. He told himself that mature people should be easy. Over time, his needs became something he was ashamed of, and shame made him silent. Asha noticed the silence as distance. She asked if he was upset. Nikhil said no. The no was meant to protect her from discomfort. It also protected the problem from being solved. Nikhil and Asha became polite companions, moving around each other carefully, each one guessing what the other wanted. Nikhil's regret arrived on an ordinary Saturday when Asha invited friends over for dinner. Nikhil helped prepare food, set the table, and smiled at the right moments. After everyone left, he sat in the living room and realized he felt exhausted, not from the work, but from the performance of being fine. He looked at Asha across the room and understood something that frightened him. He was letting his own life happen around him without participating honestly. Later in life, regret can arrive when a person realizes that peace bought through self-erasure is not peace. It is simply silence. In Dr. Miller's office, Nikhil heard himself say a simple sentence he had avoided for years. He said he did not know how to speak plainly without feeling guilty. He said he was tired of being easy. He said he wanted closeness that did not require guessing. Dr. Miller did not offer quick fixes. Dr. Miller offered a small practice. Pick one conversation a week where Nikhil would say one true thing directly, without apology and without explanation. Not a dramatic confession. A small truth. A preference. A boundary. A need. Nikhil went home that evening and found Asha in the kitchen. He told her he wanted to talk for a few minutes and asked her to sit with him at the table. He felt his old instinct to soften everything, to make it harmless. He let the instinct pass. Nikhil told Asha that he often agreed out of habit and then felt resentful. He told her he did not want resentment to be the background of their marriage. He told her he wanted to learn how to be honest sooner, while it still mattered. The words were plain. They were enough. Asha listened quietly. Her face tightened and then softened. She did not demand a solution. She acknowledged that she felt distance too. They spoke for a long time, not solving everything, but opening a door that had been stuck. Over the next months, Nikhil practiced small truths. He chose a restaurant sometimes. He declined one invitation and suggested another plan. He told Asha when he felt overwhelmed instead of waiting until he withdrew. The changes were simple, and they changed the texture of his days. Nikhil's regret became useful. It showed him that a life spent being agreeable can become a life spent unseen. The positive part was that the pattern could still be changed. Not with loud declarations, but with quiet consistency. Nikhil felt calmer, not because conflict vanished, but because he stopped treating honesty as danger. The result was not perfection. It was peace with more reality in it, and that kind of peace felt like acceptance. In the early evening, the house settled into a familiar quiet. Outside, the sky darkened slowly. Inside, the rooms held the evidence of an ordinary life. Dishes drying on a rack, a jacket draped over a chair, a lamp turned low in the corner. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. Regret rarely arrives as a single thunderclap. More often it arrives as quiet recognition. It appears when time feels more visible, when the future feels shorter, when small choices begin to look like the architecture of a life. The stories in this episode are not warnings meant to frighten. They are reminders meant to steady. Each person noticed something late, but not too late. Each person recognized a pattern and chose a small correction. The correction did not erase the past. It changed the direction. There is a hopeful truth hidden inside regret. Regret proves that a person can see clearly. It proves that a person still cares. It proves that the heart has not gone numb. The pain is not the goal. The clarity is. Later in life, what tends to matter most is not the image a person maintained, or the arguments they won, or the amount they managed to accumulate. What matters is closeness that was nourished, time that was used with awareness, and a self that was not abandoned for decades at a stretch. If you recognize yourself in any of these patterns, the task is not to punish yourself. The task is to make one small change while you still can. One call, one honest sentence, one boundary, one afternoon spent in the way you keep saying you want to spend your days. quiet corrections count. They count because they compound. They count because they return you to your own life. Peaceful acceptance does not mean approving of every choice you made. It means acknowledging what happened without trying to rewrite it, and then choosing what to do with today. The remaining years do not need to be perfect to be meaningful. They need to be lived with attention, and attention is something you can practice in the next hour, not only in some imagined future season. This is where regret becomes less of a weight and more of a guide. It points to what matters. It invites a calmer pace. It asks for gentleness, not performance. And if you begin now, quietly, you may find something surprising. The small changes do not just reduce regret, they also increase gratitude. Gratitude for what is still here. Gratitude for what can still be repaired. Gratitude for the ordinary moments that become precious only when you finally stop rushing past them.